I don't even know how to open this one other than to say Halloween is absolutely immaculate. It has come to my attention as I've been covering these slasher franchises back to back that every single one of them has what I consider to be at least one perfect film. Friday the 13th had Jason Lives, Scream had, well, Scream, and Nightmare on Elm Street had 2, with both the original film and Dream Warriors hitting that S tier spot for me. But you know what? Out of all the films I'm covering this slasher season, this first Halloween film might be the most perfect. And by the way, before anyone coming into the series for the first time with this episode gets all, actually in the comments and points out that something can't be more perfect, I've explained what I mean when I say perfect movies before. Go watch the Jason Lives episode. I said what I said. Halloween is the most perfect of all the perfect films I've covered. John Carpenter's 1978 slasher classic is for me the absolute poster boy of how to make a slasher flick. If this film was a video game, it would be the first Super Mario Bros. By today's standards, you could say it's somewhat basic, but it sets the standard for every single thing that follows. Still totally holds up and just feels like such a groundbreaker in so many ways. Though Halloween is not the first slasher film, as a lot of people mistakenly credit it to be, that title belongs to, depending on how you personally define the genre, either 1960s Peeping Tom by Michael Powell or Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which released only a month later. And even if you don't include them for whatever reason, 1974's Black Christmas and Texas Chainsaw Massacre both preceded this movie by 4 years, and Black Christmas was a huge influence on its creation. But nevertheless, Halloween is still a genre-defining piece of work. It is, to put it simply, the best possible film it could have been. It is the ultimate example of making something out of nothing. Filmmakers John Carpenter and Deborah Hill had one job: come up with a movie about babysitters being stalked. That was it. No script, no solid outline, and quite frankly, barely even a concept. And they took that tiny little sliver of the suggestion and ran with it, making the single best movie you literally ever could from that building block. The film came about after Irwin Yablans, an independent film producer, saw John Carpenter's action thriller Assault on Precinct 13 and recognised the filmmaker as having some talent. He offered him the assignment, and Carpenter and his then girlfriend Deborah Hill got working on a script that was at the time called The Babysitter Murders. Yablans later suggested setting the movie on Halloween night and naming it after the holiday, which was such a good call. As good as this movie might have still been under Carpenter's direction, I doubt it would have been half the success it was without the Halloween title and setting. Title-wise, it's a much easier one to market, especially around the film's original October release date, and setting-wise, it adds so much of a rich atmosphere. Hello, Future Dan here, looking like a maniac because I've just had to, in the middle of taking my makeup off, go down a fucking rabbit hole to try and correct what might be misinformation. Allow me to explain. So 2 things I do actually want to correct on. I said that Irwin Yablans saw John Carpenter's thriller Assault on Precinct 13. I wasn't clear on that he distributed it, and that's how he has a relationship with John Carpenter. I think it was at the time called Siege, but Yablans distributed Assault on Precinct 13. And actually, apparently, the film was always going to be set at Halloween. I did just say that Yablans later suggested setting the movie on Halloween night and naming it after the holiday, and then I go on to say why that was a good call. Point is, I am led to believe, as far as I can find, that the plan was always to set it on Halloween. The thing that makes no fucking sense though, and has left me in this fucking 4-hour spiral of research, ignore the bus sound in the background, this is all very amateur shot and kind of off the cuff. I apologise for the production and the state of my face right now, but I went full fucking Pepe Sylvia on this thing. That is not a conspiracy board, that is about this, but whatever. Anyway, apparently, there may never have been a draft called The Babysitter Murders. So, the reason this all came about and the reason I'm in like half makeup right now is I've kind of had to go on this tangent because as I was taking my makeup off after we're just sort of finished for the day, Jamie's on camera right now, say hello Jamie. There we go. We just sort of finished filming for the day, and we're transferring files over, and Netflix have just put out a documentary in their Movies That Made Us series on Halloween. Since we've just done Halloween stuff, I thought put that on in the background. That'll be a fun thing to unwind to. And I start taking off my makeup when I hear fucking producer Erwin Yablans, they're talking in the documentary about how the first draft was called The Babysitter Murders, and Yablans goes, "No it wasn't, that's bullshit." Fucking what, sir? What? Have you waited to reveal this information until I have wrote this script just to spite me? Because it certainly feels like it, because finding out the truth of this was no fucking easy task. What the hell? Everybody knows there was a draft called The Babysitter Murders. That's always been a thing, right? There's even a film literally called The Babysitter Murders in tribute to that fact. But he says it's bullshit. If you've read it on the internet, it's dog shit. It's garbage. Like, never happened. It was always meant to be called Halloween. And I'm like, well, he's the producer, so he would know. So I'm like, well, where's this Babysitter Murders rumor come from? So I do some Googling and I find out one of the references was in a book that I remembered I read at uni. So I tracked down the book, and sure enough, that book, it says The Babysitter Murders. Like, it mentions in an interview, John Carpenter said that the film was first called The Babysitter Murders. So I'm like, what the fuck? So I search for this interview. And I find this takes us down to this page where the keyword suggests that The Babysitter Murders is in the page on Google. You know how you get the little keywords that sort of preview the page? It says The Babysitter Murders in that keywords thing, but it takes us to the site, and the site is this study guide, and it's got a paywall on it. And it's a paywall that will gain you access to, among other things, this Sight and Sound article. So I think, well, I'm not a mug. I know that Sight and Sound have film archives. So I go to the Sight and Sound film archives, and I find this interview that is supposedly behind this paywall. Control F in it. No mention of The Babysitter Murders. So I'm like, so what the hell? Where's this quote come from? I then find the same quote, or a different quote where John Carpenter references The Babysitter Murders on BBC with no references to where they got it. And then I'm like, well, what the hell? Okay, maybe John Carpenter's a bust. Maybe I'll go down the Deborah Hill route. And I did manage to find Deborah Hill. She has also said, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, Deborah Hill said that the film was originally called The Babysitter Murders. Okay, cool. So that sells it, right? And then I think, hold the fuck up, you're forgetting something. And a memory just comes back to me. I remember vividly, I watched a Halloween documentary in preparation of making these videos, and it just completely skimmed over me. John Carpenter says this.
Erwin said, let's make a horror film about babysitters who are stalked by this psychotic killer. He suggested we put it on Halloween night, play the whole thing on Halloween night, and call the movie Halloween.
What the fuck, John? What's the truth? I have no idea if there was ever a draft called The Babysitters, the Babysitter Murders. And if there wasn't a draft called The Babysitter Murders, I have no idea where this rumor came from. I cannot find the source of its origin. I am sorry if I spread misinformation, but hopefully this clears up some of the shit surrounding it, and I am so tired. I'm going to go take off makeup now. Enjoy the rest of the video. Financier Mustafa Akkad was brought in to put up the film's low $300,000 budget, which Yablans said he basically had to trick him into giving up by using his own ego against him, telling him that $300,000 would probably be way too much for him to invest, knowing his pride couldn't take it. The final screenplay took around 10 days to write, and besides the key concept of babysitter stalking and the Halloween setting, Yablans and Akkad basically left all creative control to Carpenter and Hill, with Yablans making some suggestions but happy to take Carpenter and Hill's lead on the final decisions. The two bashed out the final script in less than a month, with the core concept being developed from killer stalks babysitters to something that was more like a study of evil in general. In the book, writing the horror movie, Deborah Hill is quoted as saying, "The idea was that you couldn't kill evil, and that was how we came about the story. We went back to the old idea of Samhain, that Halloween was the night where all the souls are let out to wreak havoc upon the living, and then came up with the story about the most evil kid who ever lived. And when John came up with this fable of a town with a dark secret of someone who once lived there and now that evil had come back, that's what made Halloween work. And my God, did it work indeed. We open on a house on Halloween night, though specifically a house through the eyes of an unseen observer. The film immediately placing us in the voyeuristic viewpoint of our soon-to-be killer. Through this perspective, we glance through the windows at a young girl and her boyfriend. The two go upstairs and we walk inside. We go to the kitchen. We grab a knife. As the boyfriend leaves, we skulk upstairs. We find a clown mask and put it on, our vision becoming filtered through its small eye slots. The music is building. The girl sings to herself in the other room. We see clothes strewn around the floor. We take ourselves and our knife into the girl's room. She is undressed and recognizes us. She yells at us, wanting us to leave. The music crescendos as we suddenly stab her. We, the audience, complicit in this horrendous act. We walk outside as a car pulls up and a man and a woman get out. The man calls out our name, confused. He reaches down to our mask and pulls it off. And for the first time, we cut to an audience perspective on the action. We were a child, a little boy named Michael, who has just inexplicably murdered his sister. He stands there and stares, still holding the knife. He seems neither pleased or distraught by his actions. He feels nothing. We feel everything. Holy shit! What an opener! You know, I'm really glad I covered this series after Friday the 13th, because it meant I got to watch Friday the 13th first and come back to Halloween after, and my god, the difference in these movies and how they use their techniques is night and day. It's no secret that Friday the 13th was an intentional rip-off of Halloween strapped to a different setting. But watching them so close together like this, it is staggering to see what a difference the way you tell a story can make on the final piece. There's plenty of POV shots in Friday, but none of them feel like this opening. With Friday, it's often a quick flash just to show the killer is watching. With Halloween, you get this slowly creeping build. We watch through the window, we pick up the knife, we put on the mask, there's a patience to it. The shot goes on for a whopping and undisturbed 3.5 minutes before our reveal, which sets the film up on a chilling punch. Speaking of, I know this kid is only in the film for like 20 seconds, but what a performance! I love the way he barely seems to react to the mask being pulled off his face. His body seemingly subconsciously acknowledging it as he closes his eyes when the material scrapes past them, but his mind seemingly doesn't register it at all as he immediately drops back into this resting, blank stare, still raising the knife with the other arm. This kid has stared into the abyss, and the abyss has stared back. Incredible opening. Not missing a beat, we then cut to the film's opening titles, and even these are a masterpiece. Carpenter's iconic main title theme plays as we slowly track into the left eye of a smiling pumpkin. It sells the setting, it sells the atmosphere, it sells the themes, with the eye zoom homaging the film's use of perspectives, once again putting us in the eye of the creepy thing on screen. It's a perfect title sequence with a perfect score that is, for my money, the greatest piece of music of any of the franchises I've covered this season by a long shot, and possibly the greatest horror theme ever. Carpenter's score is so important to this flick, its impact cannot be understated. There was a time during development that Carpenter screened a final cut minus sound effects and music to a young executive from Fox, and she was thoroughly unimpressed and not at all scared. He later showed it to her again with the music added in, and she loved it. Never underestimate the importance of the relationship between horror and sound. Sound is always important to film, but that's never more true than with the horror genre. If you want to experiment and see how true this is, go and dig out any film that scares you. Go to its most terrifying sequence and watch it on mute or with a different score. I guarantee you it will not come anywhere near as close to affecting you. Can you believe that Carpenter was only paid $10,000 for his duties on this movies? That's $10,000 total, to cover writing, directing, and score. The title theme alone is worth 10 times that much. It's incredible. In a way, actually, those opening titles are the perfect little microcosm of what makes Halloween great. For all the praise I've thrown on them, it's essentially a slow track into a pumpkin against a black backdrop. But that's just it, isn't it? It's so beautifully simple. There's no wasted decisions, no unnecessary flair. It's horror with all the fat trimmed. It has the smallest budget out of any film I'll cover this month, but it never feels like it needs anything more, because it always takes the purest route to its scares with no frills attached. Not because it can't afford the thrills, but because it simply does not need them. It's never boring, it never lets up, there's never a wasted minute. Every penny is put exactly where it needs to go, and while it's almost, dare I even say, basic in its end result, it is masterful in its basics. It's so simple in its approach that to describe the plot alone isn't remotely doing the film justice. I can honestly sum it up in a paragraph. 15 years after he murdered his sister at age 6, Michael Myers escapes from Smith's Grove Sanitarium where he was incarcerated when his psychiatrist Dr. Loomis arrives to escort him to a court hearing. Michael then returns to Haddonfield, the site of his original murders, with Loomis in pursuit, who attempts to track him down with the help of a local police sheriff, fearing the terror he is capable of. Michael dons a mask and begins to stalk random teens before murdering them in an emotionally detached killing spree, and one of the teens, Laurie Strode, becomes the sole survivor, managing to stave Michael off after all of her friends are killed, long enough to stay alive in time for Dr. Loomis to show up and shoot Michael, saving her and presumably killing the masked murderer in the process, only for Michael to disappear into the night with his wounds, leaving behind nothing but the carnage he wrought this Halloween night, on this small little bubble of white picket fenced middle class America. That's it. That's it. That's the whole film. It does no more, it does no less. You'd be forgiven for thinking from the simple synopsis of murderer escapes, kills some teens, then flees, that this could be any other generic slasher, filling the bargain bins of a VHS store before fading into obscurity forever. But no, this is so much more. Halloween is not a movie you celebrate for its plot, you celebrate Halloween for its execution. In this film, Carpenter and Hill don't need horrifying special effects, skin-crawling stylized murders, or even blood to get under your skin. This film is shockingly light on gore. What it has instead is a creeping sense of dread. To compare it to Friday the 13th again, in that film, a killer would watch from a distance before jumping out with some gory flash. In Halloween, the killer doesn't jump out, he lingers. The film uses its foregrounds and backgrounds to spectacular effect. It feels like the presence of Michael is always in frame, whether we're watching him through his eyes, seeing him skulk from a distance, or just stand clear as day in the middle of the frame. There's always the feeling that he could strike at any time. It's suspense over surprise. The jump scares are rare in this movie, and their sparsity only makes them more effective when they do crop up. The vast majority of the time in the movie, you see Michael coming. He doesn't jump out at you so much as hang in your gaze until you're deeply uncomfortable and walk slowly in your direction. One of my favourite examples of this occurs late in the movie. Laurie thinks she has killed Michael and pauses in the foreground to collect herself, and there, in the background, just out of focus, Michael sits up. This isn't met with some sudden jolt of music. He doesn't suddenly leap at the camera as a violin string screeches out of tune in your ear. The music starts slow, deliberate, building. He hangs there, out of focus, looking at Laurie, who still doesn't notice him. We watch him stand and walk wordlessly towards her, hoping the whole time that Laurie will hear him, praying that she'll turn and run. This is Halloween's mastery. This is what it excels at. It's constantly playing this game of cat and mouse with its audience. It winds them up tight. It's patient where its audience is not. You almost start rooting for the violence to happen, not because you want to see it, but just to get it over with. You just need something, anything to relieve a little bit of this tension, but the film delays it time and time again, withholding the big scares because it knows that subtlety is where it can really get you. That when our brains worry about what's going to happen, it's always the worry that is harder to deal with than the thing we are worried about. The scariest moment in any horror film is not when the killer gets his victim, it's the bit just beforehand when they're about to. That moment where it's almost there. They're just outside the closet. They can hear us breathing. What's going to happen next? Oh my god, he's noticed me. Oh god, he's walking over. Oh god, he knows I'm in here. To make a crude but I think honestly pretty apt analysis, if say the frights of films like Friday the 13th were the equivalent to sex, then Halloween is sex with a huge focus on foreplay. The film is obsessed with the tease. After the opening murder that sets the scene in the film's opening, we don't see another kill play out in front of us until a whopping 54 minutes into the movie. That's nearly a whole hour into the hour and a half runtime. But it doesn't feel slow or dragged out because it's always playing with that suspenseful feeling of being stalked. We're constantly shifting either from Michael's twisted perspective, his haunting heavy breathing punctuating his voyeuristic gaze, to seeing him in the distance or lurking up close, maybe obscured behind a sheet on a washing line or driving in the background in a car. Always there in a way the characters, and sometimes even you as the audience, can never be sure if you've seen him or not. And when he isn't there, you still feel his presence. His impact on this world is still always front and centre of the film's focus, as Donald Pleasance's performance as Dr. Loomis is incredible. His monologues describing the evil he saw in Michael, the panic in his voice when he speaks of the destruction the man is capable of, his desperate efforts to track him down. Loomis speaks and acts like a man who saw the devil, and you believe he did. This is another under-celebrated aspect of this slasher flick. Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, Texas Chainsaw, Child's Play. The killer almost always has to be discovered in slashers. The characters start off blissfully unaware of the evil forces surrounding them and have to discover what they're capable of as the film goes on. They don't know to be scared from the moment the film starts, but Loomis does. Loomis is terrified, and he gives us every warning that we should be too. Speaking of performances, it probably also goes without saying that the exceptionally talented Jamie Lee Curtis, who plays our final girl and protagonist Laurie Strode, is great in this too. She gives the film a real human anchor to hang on to. She feels like a real teenager. She chats with her friends, she goes to school, she goofs around with kids, she babysits. She just seems like a nice, normal person whose life is suddenly turned upside down when this horrendous monster just comes crashing into it without warning. She's very easy to root for, and her terrified performance really sells just how harrowing her encounter with Michael Myers really is. And Myers himself is one of the most incredible on-screen villains there is in this film. Nick Castle was paid only $25 a day for his performance. And you might argue that he almost doesn't have to act in this thing. It's very robotic in that it's a lot of just standing, walking, and occasionally killing, and not much else. But that's the whole point. Carpenter never gave Castle any direction. It was just stand here, walk there, do this. Pure clinical instructions and nothing else. But pair those movements with the score and the sound effect of Michael's heavy breathing, and it is effective as hell. Here's a character with this cold, emotionless detachment from all of his brutal acts, and it only makes him more frightening. There's no motive, there's no feelings, there's nothing. These random acts of violence are entirely senseless. We have no clue what makes this character tick. We can hypothesize, sure. Many people analysing the film have suggested a kind of psychosexual element to the killing, spurred on by the fact that Michael seems to murder his undressed sister, arguably somewhat in a vengeful manner for the action of having sex with her boyfriend. But really, it's all speculation because in terms of any actual emotions attached to his acts, there's nothing there. That's what makes him so horrifying. It also makes Carpenter's one single direction for the character that much more compelling. In a rare moment of something registering beneath the mask, Michael stabs the character Bob and pins him to the wall and uncharacteristically takes a moment to register what he sees before him. Apparently Carpenter's given direction to actor Nick Castle here was that he should look at Bob's corpse like it was an interesting butterfly collection. And this is where this pause and considered head tilt comes in. Genius move by Carpenter that's executed brilliantly in its simplicity by Castle there. They give us something so little, but we see it and we immediately want more of it. Some hope that we might understand what makes this character tick, but this crumb of insight is all we get, and it's in its reserved nature and unwillingness to explain itself that the character only becomes even more compelling. To put it simply, Halloween is pure craft. It is astonishing that a film about a dude in a mask murdering babysitters can be this good. But any story is only as good as the way you tell it, and Carpenter and Hill are clearly master storytellers. They created the ultimate incomprehensible evil in Michael Myers, painted a beautifully realised suburban Halloween backdrop for him to exist in, and just let him loose. This might be my absolute favourite slasher film. Hell, it might be one of my favourite films of all time, which as anyone who watches this channel regularly will know is testament to its quality, because I normally go for the happier end of the horror spectrum. But Halloween closes out with Michael's heavy breathing cut over wide shots of all the peaceful places he's disturbed with his violence. Hardly cheery stuff. And yet, I just can't fault it. It's just such a perfect execution of what it sets out to do that I become completely immersed in its story and characters. Great movie. Don't just watch it, study it. This is a masterclass in suspense and characterization, in setting and budget, in pace and execution. Every single thing about this film works, and it still holds up despite being the oldest movie I'll cover all month. It's scary, suspenseful, and brilliantly subtle in its approach to horror. Its only problem? There were several more of them after this. And when you smash it this hard right out of the gate, it can only go downhill from here. And my god, does this series drop off quick, drop off weird, and drop off hard. So yesterday we discussed Halloween, an incredible film with an incredible mastery of scares through subtlety. Halloween 2 is not quite as subtle. Halloween 2 is no Halloween 1. John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, who wrote and respectively directed and produced the first film back in '78, were not high on this film's creation. Carpenter described the writing process for this movie as mainly dealing with a lot of beer, sitting in front of a typewriter and saying, "What the fuck am I doing? I don't know." In fact, if you believe Tommy Lee Wallace, who was the editor and production designer on the first film, and very briefly played Michael Myers in the closet scene towards the end, no one was all that excited over the possibility of a sequel. And it's kind of easy to see why, really. Halloween is a perfect one and done film. It is a complete story from beginning to end. Its closing moments, with the killer escaping and his heavy breath lingering over the image of the different homes he struck, could be seen as sequel bait, I suppose, but really it was made to be terrifying in its ambiguity. The killer is loose, he disappears into the night, and the audience is left with that sensation that he could be anywhere, hiding somewhere in the dark corners of a quiet and peaceful neighbourhood just like theirs, waiting for his moment to strike once again. It should always have been an unresolved question of, where did he go? And for a sequel to come along and say, oh wait, there he is, it's kind of a fundamentally flawed platform to kick off from. The team who created this thing seemingly didn't want to make it at all. Carpenter even refused to direct, wanting to remove himself as much as possible from the creative process, having said, I made that film once, I really didn't want to do it again. He couldn't even give the job away at first, having offered it to his previously mentioned editor Tommy Lee Wallace, who, despite the huge opportunity this would have been for him in getting to make his directorial debut on millions of dollars of budget and an almost guaranteed financial hit being a franchise sequel to an already massive success story, was still just like, nah John, appreciate it, but you're alright dude, I'll pass. Eventually, they did find a director in the inexperienced Rick Rosenthal, whose only previous credits included some soap opera episodes. He got the job because of a short film called The Toya he made while a student. And you know, credit to him, this film isn't amazing, but for a first effort for a soap opera director chosen for a student short, it's not bad. The question is though, if everyone involved was really not keen on the idea of this film, why did it get made at all? And for that, we once again have to give the answer we give for a lot of the times we ask that question. Money. Erwin Yablans, who produced the first Halloween, was keen to make a sequel, since the first film had proved such a huge financial success. And as John Carpenter says in the documentary In Search of Darkness, while he didn't want to do Halloween 2 at all, he knew that if he didn't, they'd just do it without him. So he'd rather at least be involved in some way. So he and Deborah Hill threw together a script, one that apparently Yablans was disappointed by, calling it pedestrian and predictable. But who gives a fuck, right? There's money to be made. Let's take these drunken half-thoughts of reluctant writers, miserable with their work, and go make millions of dollars off of it. So, with a half-cocked script and a filmmaking team who'd rather be at home, how did this film that writer John Carpenter would later refer to as an abomination turn out? Well, honestly, you'd be surprised. For a film that probably never should have existed, it's not that bad. Following in the immediate aftermath of the first film's ending, where Michael was shot by Dr. Loomis and falls from a balcony before escaping, Michael now wanders the neighbourhood as reports of his escape broadcasts on the local news stations. He enters a home to steal a kitchen knife and immediately carries on where he left off, continuing his kill streak by murdering a girl next door. Meanwhile, Laurie Strode is taken to hospital and Loomis and the sheriff immediately jump back onto the streets to hunt the killer. At one point, Loomis thinks he sees Michael, but it's just a kid, Ben Tramer, a character very briefly mentioned in the first film as being someone main girl Laurie is alluded to having a crush on, in an extremely coincidentally similar costume to the killer. Bit far-fetched. It's not like a Michael Myers costume would be a thing in this universe you could buy at a store, even in a tasteless costumes that's based on real life sense, since this is set the first night of Michael's escape. So I'm really not sure what Ben is supposed to be costumed as for Halloween here. Like, white man in boiler suit? I don't know, but whatever, we'll go with it. Anyway, Loomis's mistake causes a cacophony of confusion, which results in this happening. Well, you can tell they're making use of that inflated budget this time around. This film was a $2.5 million production versus the just over $300,000 cost of the first one. Not sure that money is being used in the right places though. This feels at odds with the tone of the first film. It's definitely a lot less reserved. To the film's credit though, despite the occasional moment of blah, violence and explosions, throw money at the screen that occasionally populate its runtime, director Rick Rosenthal does a pretty solid job of capturing a lot of the atmosphere present in the original. I remember Roger Ebert, esteemed critic who famously wasn't very kind with regards to slashers but was a big defender of the first film, said of this movie that it was a pale imitation of the imitators that first movie had spawned. And I don't think that's quite fair. While it's definitely a great deal more gratuitous and almost shares more in common with something like the Friday the 13th franchise at times than its predecessor, with its greater focus on in-your-face action, gory kills and more obvious titillation, I'd still say it has enough elements going for it that it stands above a lot of its peers. This is not as lazy and schlocky a film as most people made it out to be. There's a fair amount of genuine tension, visually interesting cinematic choices, and the characters of Michael, Dr. Loomis, and Laurie Strode are as compelling as ever. It's just that unfortunately, the extra time we spend with them is peppered with a fair amount of cheap shocks. Every now and then it'll threaten to be a somewhat interesting and atmospheric continuation of that first movie, but then it'll just pull some cheap, egregious bullshit, like for example the excessively loud occurrence of a cat jumping out of a dumpster. No, Halloween 1 would never. Speaking of bullshit, it's not just the cheap scares and explosions, but a couple of plot beats too that really drag an otherwise fairly solid, if not very familiar film down, but don't worry, we'll get to those. So Michael hears a news report explaining that Laurie has been taken to the hospital and decides to pop round to give her a visit, cutting the phone lines and slashing the car tyres in the car park on his way over. On his hunt for Laurie, he kills a bunch of the hospital staff, with this poor, undeserving nurse getting one of the most excessive deaths of the entire franchise, having her head repeatedly dunked into scalding hot water and being boiled alive. And we also get one of the most accidentally comical instances of injury, when this guy, Jimmy, a paramedic with a bit of a thing for new inpatient Laurie, finds a body Michael has left behind before slipping in her blood and knocking himself unconscious. Alright. Meanwhile, back on Loomis's hunt, he finds out that Michael broke into an elementary school and wrote Samhain in blood on the chalkboard, which Loomis hypothesizes connects Michael to the occult, and this is suggested to be an explanation for why he's so invulnerable. No, this is, to put it bluntly, so dumb. Just an absolutely pointless addition of lore to a character who works specifically because we don't understand him. The idea that a man this terrifying could simply exist and be this evil, someone who just doesn't seem to stop in his pursuit of unmotivated violence no matter what, is incredibly compelling in its horrifying ambiguity. Michael got shot 6 times at near point blank range and didn't die. Is this wild? Yes. Can I just believe it? Absolutely. No one needed an explanation. No one walked out of that 1978 film and went, that was great, but I'm supposed to believe that dude got shot and still got up? No way. And if anyone did say that, then they fundamentally misunderstood that story. This stupid Michael is some immortal concoction of demonic occult practices is not only absurd and raises a whole bunch of questions like, when the hell did the 6-year-old of the first movie get involved with Celtic pagan history, but also, to put it in the analytical language of academia, it's just fucking shit. Just a big ol' load of bollocks in it. This completely detracts from Michael's mystique. The man is terrifying because aside from a very slightly cinematic touch of a seemingly excessive strength and ambiguous invulnerability, he's completely grounded in reality. This horrifying human, this innate evil that we cannot comprehend, could quite possibly exist, because ultimately, he's just a mute man in a mask with an unexplainable bloodlust. To attach some ridiculous notion of some kind of supernatural witchcraft to him is to undo all of that. He's no longer grounded in realism, he is entirely a product of pure fiction. He's no longer frighteningly real, he's a fairy tale, something that could only exist in stories. This totally undermines the character, and after this moment, I fully believe John Carpenter when he suggests he wrote this thing while drunk. Not to linger on this for too long though, we immediately follow this nonsense bullshit up with yet even more nonsense bullshit. After Loomis is told by his colleague Marion that he has to abandon his search on governor's orders, he is escorted back to Smith Grove along with Marion by a US court-martial. While sat in the back of the car, Marion informs him that new information has come to light on the Michael Myers patient. It turns out that Laurie Strode is Michael's younger sister, who was put up for adoption and given a name change after Michael's parents died in a crash, and the records on this were previously sealed to protect the family, but have now been released, and Loomis realizes that Michael's reasoning for coming back to Haddonfield is that he killed one sister, and now he wants to kill another. No! I'm grateful that the film chooses to get its most egregious bullshit out of the way in rapid fire, but this Laurie as Michael's sister plotline might be even more of a terrible misstep than the occult stuff. Again, this raises so many questions if you even stop to think about it for a second. For one, how? How the fuck could Michael possibly know that Laurie Strode is his sister? Like, sure, okay, we'll believe that he had another younger sibling during the events of the first film. Whatever, let's say we go with that. There was a young kid somewhere in this family who just wasn't on screen during that first film's first murder. Maybe she was with a relative or something. Let's just pretend we buy that. Michael was 6 when the murders happened. 6. Laurie, being 4 years younger, would have been 2. She was basically a baby. Michael has been incarcerated for 15 years. He has not seen his sister at all in that time. He does not know about the adoption. He does not know about the name change. He does not know what Laurie, who he last saw as a baby, could possibly look like now. How in the fuck would Michael not only know that this girl, a fully grown 17-year-old that he last saw as a baby, who has a completely different name to his sister, and who the records on revealing any of this information were sealed away, how would he know that Laurie is his sister to even be obsessed with her in the first place? Also, how, even if he did know that Laurie was adopted and had her name changed, which we have no reason whatsoever to believe that he did, but let's just assume that's the case, how did he know that it was by a family still in Haddonfield? She could have been moved anywhere. And speaking of, what a mad coincidence that Laurie was adopted by a family 3 doors down from her old murder house. Come the fuck on. I am not one to kind of hammer in on this plot holy stuff. This isn't cinema sins, that's not what we're here for. I could honestly forgive all of this nonsense if it made for something thematically interesting, but the reason I'm so bothered about how borderline intelligence insulting this plot point is because not only does it ask us to believe something quite impossible within the context of the narrative, it is also thematically detracting. The thing that's really bullshit with this point is not that Laurie being his sister doesn't make sense. It's that once again, much like the occult stuff, it undermines the themes and ideas that surround the character of Michael. As I've already said, Michael is terrifying because his violent acts are seemingly random. His motivations can't be understood. He could strike anyone and everyone with no rhyme or reason, and seemingly without even drawing any emotions from his horrendous acts. That's terrifying. The only thing scarier than horrific violence is senseless horrific violence. But nah, Michael's just a sister killer. I mean, it's significantly less scary. I mean, for a start, I'm not his sister. You're not his sister. If this dude were real now, so long as we kept out the way of him and his familial issues, we're all in the clear. In Carpenter and Hill's defense, they also hate this plot point. Carpenter has even called it silly and foolish. It was never planned so much as conceived, as Carpenter put it, purely as a function of having decided to become involved in the sequel to the movie, where I didn't think there was really much of a story left. And I get it. It feels like a revelation that justifies a sequel's existence, as bad as that revelation is. As without it and the dumb occult stuff, the movie is simply just more of the same. There's nothing for Michael to do here but keep stalking and keep killing. But honestly, that would have been better, because now he's still doing that, he's just doing it as a far less interesting, far less scary, and far too contrived and over-explained being with almost none of the mystique he once had. The rest of the film plays out exactly as you'd expect. That's not to say the rest of it's bad exactly, it never makes any complete asspulls again, it just jumps into the familiar territory of a slowly stalking Michael trying to kill Laurie, taking out anyone he bumps into along the way, often in a more gratuitous and brutal manner than we're used to, and this time with a setting change of the hospital instead of a house, before Loomis shows up and gives him his final confrontation, and in one self-sacrificial moment puts an end to the monster by using up some of that extra budget to give him a big explosive ending, using both gas and a lighter to blow the two of them up together. The third act really isn't without merit. It's got some really good stuff in it. I love a lot of the lighting choices, and there's some really memorable visuals. An injured Michael drawing dark bloody tears down his emotionless pale mask face is a particularly awesome example. And it's a fair bit suspenseful. Not as much as Halloween 1 of course, but essentially it's like that film with the volume turned up. It's Halloween with a bit more popcorn blockbuster stylings. It's honestly pretty entertaining, and I'd even go so far as to say I had a good time with this section of the movie. In fact, I'd go so far as to say I had a good time with a lot of the movie. Yes, it pulls some cheap tricks, yes it's more gratuitous but not in a way that really provides any merit, and yes it has those two ridiculously ill-advised plot revelations that for me are the worst part of the film and really bring it down. And no, it simply is not anywhere near as well crafted, well directed, or just generally as good as that first one. But ignoring all of that, and I do realise that is a lot to ignore, it's a solid B tier slasher flick. It might be a huge step down in quality from what they originally gave us, but it's honestly a lot better than a good amount of its contemporaries. Given the option between this and something like one of the many slashers that haunted 80s VHS bargain bins, I'd always go with this. I still think it's got more creativity and stronger direction and performances than like 90% of the Friday films, but they never pretended to be anything more than a fun bit of schlock. Halloween 2 though is a sequel to one of the greatest horrors of all time, and my God does that hurt it. Perhaps if it wasn't attached to such a prestigious name, I might have just enjoyed it for the fun little slasher flick it was and not been so bothered by its missteps. But then again, if it was that, it probably wouldn't have had anything close to the same budget, never have been seen by anywhere near the same amount of people, and faded into obscurity as nothing more than another Halloween ripoff. So, it is what it is. A decent bit of entertainment, hindered by the legacy it follows. Do I recommend it? Honestly, yeah. I really despise the plot revelations and its cheap tricks do hurt it, but just taking it as a slasher film, it's got a decent atmosphere, great acting, great visuals and great characters, even if one of them has his mystique ruined. And to be honest, you can do a hell of a lot worse. It's not completely without its merits, it has its moments, and in fact, one thing I might like even a little bit better this time round is Laurie is a lot more active in saving her own life. It's nice to see her be a bit more of a fighter this time, so that's cool. Anyway, that's Halloween 2, a mixed bag with some real negatives but with a consistent enough quality and a couple of high points elsewhere that I still think it's worth a viewing. Just a bit of a turn your brain off kind of viewing. Halloween 3's biggest crime isn't its lack of Michael Myers, it's the fact that it has this little jingle.
8 more days to Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. 8 more days to Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
This has been in my head for decades.
8 more days to Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. 8 more days to Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
I've often said that the Halloween sequels are all over the place. Now often I mean that in terms of their inconsistent quality, their strange choose-your-own-adventure style continuities, or their weird, wild and often vastly different takes on the Michael Myers character. When I say that Halloween 3 is all over the place though, I don't mean to say that it's a bad film or an inconsistent one, I just mean to say that in the realm of Halloween sequels specifically, this stands out like a sore thumb. This is the first and only film I'm going to cover in this marathon that is in fact not a slasher film. Yes, I know the theme this year is slasher season, and yeah, I know my original pitch was covering every film in each of these icons' original continuity, and this connects to absolutely none of the other Halloween films. But one, there was no way my brain would let me do videos on Halloween 1, 2 and 4 and not glitch out at the missing number, and two, shut up, it's my list and I want to talk about Halloween 3, so yeah. So before we even start on talking about the film though, how did we get here with this absolutely baffling third entry that seemed to be Halloween in name only? Well, as we already mentioned in our previous video, series creators John Carpenter and Deborah Hill hated working on Halloween 2, with Carpenter later going on to call the film an abomination. It was their belief that the story was done and dusted with that original film. Didn't really matter what they thought though, there was still a huge audience desperate to see more of the iconic slasher Michael Myers, and Halloween 2, despite reviewing negatively, especially when compared to the first film, still absolutely slayed at the box office. Seeing that the franchise clearly had financial legs and keen to get Hill and Carpenter involved again, producers Irwin Yablans and Mustafa Akkad both asked the duo if they'd like to come on board for a third film. And Hill and Carpenter surprisingly accepted, but only under one very specific condition: no Michael Myers. So determined were Carpenter and Hill to never do another Halloween sequel like the last, they insisted that this Halloween be a fresh concept or they wouldn't be on it. The aim was to make the franchise an anthology series, a platform from which they could tell an original Halloween-based horror tale with every entry, each one with a decent couple of million in budget, and a solid name legacy to market on. And although it wasn't what they initially had in mind when they approached the duo, at some point along the way, someone agreed to their demands. Though if you ask Yablans, it definitely wasn't him.
I take no responsibility for Halloween 3 or credit. I had nothing to do with it. They just sent me a nice fat check.
So the film instead began production as a story about an evil corporation selling killer Halloween masks to children, and the one alcoholic doctor on his quest to uncover the shady practices of it all. Michael Myers relegated to nothing more than a tongue-in-cheek cameo when an ad for the original movie plays on a bar TV set within the movie. It was a bold and risky move, but one that the people involved were a lot more excited about. Hill and Carpenter took production roles and it became a bit of a passion project that Carpenter still sings the praises of today, mentioning as recently as this year that he loves the movie during an interview for the Halloween Kills press tour. And Tommy Lee Wallace, Carpenter's former editor who had turned down the chance to direct Halloween 2, was more than happy to jump in the chair for this entry, specifically because it was a new story. It wasn't all peaches and cream on the production side though, as the writing ended up being a little messy, with Tommy Lee Wallace credited as the sole writer on the final film, despite he himself being the first one to tell you that is far from the truth, calling it the most inaccurate credit you could ever conceive of in the making of Halloween 3 documentary. You see, what had happened was Deborah Hill had this core concept in her head. A simple idea, just a one-line pitch. Witchcraft in the computer age. And from this concept, a script was optioned from British sci-fi writer Nigel Neal, famous for the hugely influential BBC show The Quatermass Experiment, of which Carpenter was a fan. He put together a screenplay but was resistant to making any changes when given notes, and when the order came down from on high to add more gore to the movie, he asked to have his name removed from the film credits entirely. By this point, John Carpenter has already done some revisions on the script, and then Tommy Lee Wallace also revised those revisions, but in the end was the only one credited. Besides this though, it was apparently pretty smooth sailing. The cast all fell into place perfectly, shooting went well, and from interviews, everyone seemed to love working with Tommy as a director, got on well with one another, had a great time, and were proud of the work they did. So all's good, right? You've got a cool core concept, an established and celebrated sci-fi writer forming the base of the plot, the series creators are back on to produce, a great cast, a hard-working director, a massive name to sell it all on, and besides some heated rewrites, everything falls right into place. The ingredients were all there for a success, right? The reality though...
There was a horrible backlash that was crushing for me because, you know, it was perceived as a flop.
Yeah, response to the film was pretty overwhelmingly negative. Critics didn't like it, and fans just wanted to see Michael. A lot of people have theorised that if it just didn't have that Halloween title, things might have been different, and I get what they're saying. It definitely hurts the film as it sets up a certain expectation that the film was just never going to deliver on, but I'd go so far as to say I think it could maybe even have had success with that franchise name. It's just that it was the third in the series and not the second. For me, I'd say some of the problem is that they're trying to set this up as an anthology series when a second movie has already released and suggested that's not the case at all. If the film order had went 1978's original tale and then this movie, you could probably have made the case that the only thing you need to make a Halloween film is to set a story at Halloween. But when Michael's had two outings, with the second being a direct continuation of his story, you've already set him up as the backbone of the franchise. It's his narrative. Once you've put that out there, you can't take it back. Of course, we can hypothesize about other ways this film's release could have been handled forever. At the end of the day, the reality is the risk really didn't pay off for them. Halloween 3 took the lowest box office returns of the series at that point, and by quite a large margin too, dropping in takings to 14.4 million domestically, an over 10 million drop from the previous title. And with the reviews ranging from bad to lukewarm, it didn't have much critical praise to fall back on either. But here's the thing. What was once the franchise's black sheep, the oddball, the true series low point in a lot of fans' eyes, has over the years found a little bit of shine on its star. In the decades since its release, there's been a lot of reassessment, and the film has found a bit of a cult audience and an avid sea of defenders. A lot of people who now, with that distance of knowing exactly what they're getting into before seeing it and not being disappointed that a certain mass killer doesn't appear, actually hold it as a high point in the series. Which begs the question, is Halloween 3 actually good? And the answer to that question is an overwhelming kinda. The film opens strong on a couple of solid moody notes that sell not just the atmosphere but also the film's themes. The opening credits cleverly tie the film into the rest of the series, but in a way that feels much more in line with the ideas of this film. An ominous synth track plays over opening titles of strange orange lines with a soft glow digitally drawing themselves onto the screen. As the lines pile up, we realise they are drawing a pumpkin. Not unlike how both Halloween 1 and 2 opened on those smiling jack-o'-lanterns. Except here, the use of the digital display marks a clever way to both link the movies that came prior, but illustrate we're getting something a little different this time. Following the titles, we're immediately greeted with the compelling drawing of an unknown man clutching a Halloween mask, desperately fleeing an unseen pursuer. All while an excellent score continues throughout and undercuts the whole scene with an air of mystery and danger. While we're on the topic, by the way, my God, this film has an amazing and incredibly underrated score. There's nothing in here as iconic as the main Halloween theme, but Carpenter and his collaborator Alan Howarth create such an impressive level of atmosphere, and every track is consistently great. Anyway, it's revealed that the people chasing this man are these strange, almost emotionless and incredibly strong men in suits. One almost kills him, but he is able to crush the attacker with a car and make his escape before collapsing at a gas station where the owner calls for help. Our man is admitted to hospital, where we find out his name is Harry Grimbridge. It's here we're introduced to our protagonist, Dr. Daniel Chalice, a messy but well-meaning and hard-working divorced doctor who has a strained relationship with his ex-wife and his kids, and possibly a bit of an alcohol problem. He's played extremely well by horror icon Tom Atkins, who previously collaborated with Carpenter on The Fog. He's got a real 80s action hero vibe to him, but not in the way that guys like Stallone or Schwarzenegger had. He's more of an everyman type, a little older, a little less in shape, a little more grounded, but still with hints of that macho 80s bravado, and he does well to get you to like him in spite of the character's flaws. Harry cryptically tells Daniel that they're going to kill us, all of us, but Daniel puts it down to him being manic. That is until later that night a man in a suit visits the hospital and murders Harry by just yanking his skull apart. Gross and rad. And then before Daniel can stop and question him, he blows himself up in a car. Haunted by what he saw, Daniel hits the local bar where he sees an advertisement counting down the days to Halloween from a mask company called Silver Shamrock. The same one his kids were watching earlier when he visited them to bring them Halloween masks, only to have his gifts rejected when they point out that their mother already got them Silver Shamrock masks. He thinks nothing of the advert, which I honestly don't know how, because it's pretty much all I've thought about for around 20 years. And while at the bar, he runs into Ellie, Harry's daughter, who came looking for answers. She explains to Daniel that her father had an appointment book, and in retracing his steps, theorizes that whatever stuff he got tangled up in might have begun during a visit to a small town called Santa Mira in California, home of the Silver Shamrock factory that keeps putting out all those ads.
In 4 days to Halloween.
Yes, that one. We don't need to keep playing it. Determined to get to the bottom of what went on, the two journey to the town and find a small community that idolizes Silver Shamrock and its company head, Connell Cochrane, the lovable businessman who owns the factory that builds this season's most popular latex Halloween children's masks and is apparently the reason for the town's prosperity. However, Silver Shamrock's cheery and well-loved facade houses a dark secret. A local vagrant speaks out against the company and is murdered by the men in suits for his trouble. A woman who neighbours Ellie and Daniel in the motel they've checked into curiously picks at the metal that adorns the Shamrock masks, and it emits a fucking laser that melts her fucking face off. Alright. And when the next day the injured woman is discovered, she is carted off under the guidance of Connell Cochrane himself, not to hospital, but rather to the Silver Shamrock factory, and as Daniel questions this, he is met with avoidance. Investigating further, Ellie and Daniel, who at this point are shagging by the way because there's a romantic subplot shoehorned in that really doesn't need to be here, but this is an 80s movie so it's practically a given, take a guided tour of the factory where they discover more of the men in suits emotionlessly standing guard, watching and making sure no one sees anything they shouldn't. But Ellie does. Specifically, she sees her dad's car, and the men in suits don't take kindly to her discovery. The two protagonists flee and attempt to call the police, but they can't reach anyone outside of town, and before they can escape, Ellie is kidnapped by the men in suits and taken to the factory. Daniel quickly pursues, but is attacked and captured. He is then taken to a surreal laboratory setting that is very 80s, where Cochrane explains his master plan. You see, Cochrane stole one of the big blocks from Stonehenge. Yeah, I know, just let's go with it. Because he wants to return Halloween to its darker roots of pagan sacrifice and witchcraft, and he plans to do so by using occult magic and technology to activate the masks during the giveaway they've been advertising for. The idea being that when the broadcast plays, it will send out a signal that activates the fragment of Stonehenge he has put into the medallion on every one of his masks and kill the wearers in a particularly grisly fashion. Oh, and also those suit dudes are robots. He made robots. Yeah, it's a little silly. I mean, besides the core concept of a man building a Halloween mask empire and an army of robots that steal Stonehenge just to explode kids' heads is already pretty out there, but it's even more wild when you consider his motivations basically boil down to, it's just banter, innit? Just a good old friendly Halloween prank. A bit like the olden days. But ludicrous as the concept may be, thematically the businessman with the friendly demeanour using his corporate superpowers and the channel of fervent commercialism to harm society is pretty compelling, and Dan O'Herlihy is such a great actor that he perfectly balances that friendly facade while betraying the hidden evil that lies beneath. The material might be wacky, but it's sold with enough sincerity that you find yourself buying into it all the same. Also, we do get this grossly rad demonstration of his killer methods that's pretty messed up. Yeah, this movie turns a kid's head into bugs. Normally horrors won't kill the kid, but this shit's got no chill. Anyway, the film ends on an ambiguously chilling note. Daniel manages to escape and save Ellie on his way out, dropping medallions into the lab control room and activating the commercial, killing everyone except him and Ellie. Only, oh no, oh shit, Ellie's a robot. In an Invasion of the Body Snatchers style twist, Daniel has to kill the robot version of his girlfriend, which he succeeds at after a pretty gnarly little scrap. He then runs breathlessly to the gas station from the start of the movie and asks to use the phone, calling television stations and begging them to kill the Silver Shamrock broadcast. One station goes down and then another, but a third is still on the air. As the countdown to the broadcast carries on, we end on a final note of Daniel, desperate and screaming, begging for the broadcast to stop, but we do not find out if he is successful before the credits roll. And that's Halloween 3. Now look, this movie is perhaps a little unfairly maligned. It got this really bad reputation as this ill-advised and disappointing non-slasher entry into a slasher franchise, whose first film was probably the best slasher of all time. People going into this wanting something even slightly Halloween 1 or 2-esque were only ever going to be disappointed. It's a sci-fi really, with horror elements. It has more in common with an episode of The X-Files than it does with the film it pulls its title from. However, removing it from that context, this film is really not without merit. It has a lot going for it. Our three leading roles, that is Daniel, Ellie and Cochran, are all excellent. The soundtrack is moody and atmospheric and amazing. The visuals eke a kind of 80s feel that even most 80s films don't conjure. It's such a specific vibe it puts out. Like, you know how there's like this image we have of the 80s now when we make 80s nostalgia infused media where everything is kind of like pink and blue neons, but that's not really what the 80s actually looked like a lot of the time when you watch stuff from that period, and it's just more of a reflection of the parts we fixated on. Well, Halloween 3 is like the real 80s, because it doesn't look like those things, but still its effects are very 80s, its characters are very 80s, its sets and shooting locations are very 80s. I know I'm just saying 80s a lot, but you get what I mean, right? You get why this is different to this. And thematically, it actually has a lot of pretty interesting stuff to say. And yeah, it gets a little lost in the villain's silly motivations. Like, if you're gonna comment on commercialism, there should really maybe be some profit or power incentive for the villain to explain why this guy does what he does, but it still hits some interesting notes. A lot of times you'll get rich businessmen in stories and they're always like transparently greedy, ruthless oil tycoons or like violent criminals, and oftentimes they just don't quite resonate with our experiences in reality. Evil, influential, wealthy and powerful people tend to be a lot more insidious in their actions. There's often a concerted effort to kind of push this PR-friendly narrative that whatever they're doing is good, actually, and I feel like Cochran as a villain taps a lot more into that kind of stuff. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's cool how a lot of the community are shown to really like and even idolise him. Characters who he later goes on to kill. In amongst all of the oddness, I found this strangely believable. I fully buy that this awful, sinister character would be kind of propped up and adored as some genius entrepreneur, despite the fact that he essentially sells novelty garbage. The movie even goes so far as to explicitly have a character call him a true genius, and then later in the film gush poetically that he made his fortune selling absolute tat like sticky toilet paper. Like, whoa! I wasn't convinced of his intellectual superiority before, but now that I know he invented the practical joke of sticky toilet paper, I'm sold. All the stuff surrounding Cochran and his factory that isn't tied in with the occult and Stonehenge bits is really good. You know, he's got these literal unpaid, unfeeling drones working for him as the perfect employees. He's got this big unspoken hold on the area. I particularly like how prominent the factory sort of feels like it looms over the town. It feels really big and imposing, and visually to me that really sells the idea of this hold he has over it. And the concept that an injured woman is taken to the factory rather than a hospital, and this mostly goes unchallenged outside of Daniel and Ellie being like, huh, that's weird, is super compelling. Like, this idea that this community is just giving this dude total control over all aspects of their life, from their jobs to their general economy to their surveillance to, I guess, their healthcare? Because I mean, this doesn't feel like a first time occurrence. The guy seems well equipped for the scenario of needing to take dead or injured people to his factory, and he even decides what time the citizens can go out, because at one point he just announces a curfew, and I guess everybody is just like, yeah, let's let the dude who sells novelty masks decide we can't stay out after 6 PM, because well, he's got a lot of money, so I guess it makes sense. And all this of course ends with that chilling ambiguous possibility that the commercialism won out in the end. It's all very riveting stuff and told with a nice 80s style and great performances. On the other hand though, I do think that in our reappraisal of this film, we've been so excited at the discovery that there's actually good stuff there that we forgot to acknowledge its flaws and weaker elements, of which there are still plenty. I've already mentioned the villain's motives are kinda silly and somewhat undermine the commentary you get from making him so face value nice but evil under the surface, by then just falling into this kind of caricature of evil that just really loves killing kids. Just loves it, mate. Favourite thing. The kind of guy who just sees a kid and thinks, oh, there's a kid whose head would be better as bugs. But even besides that, the real problem with this thing is just that it plays out at a snail's pace. Now, I don't mind slower paced movies, so this doesn't bother me hugely, but the problem with Halloween 3 specifically is you've solved a lot of the mystery it's set up like 10 to 20 minutes in, and you just have to wait for the characters to catch up with you. Right at the start of the movie, when the guy blows himself up in the car, Daniel calls this lass who works autopsies and is like, hey, what was that dude's deal? Did you get anything from the autopsy? And she's just like, oh, I don't know, I've just got all this metal. That's weird. Someone must have given me the car parts instead of the body. There's no human element here. And so of course you're like, oh, okay, they're robots. It's so clear that they're robots. Like, the way they act makes you suspect it, and this line just confirms it. But there's 2 more check-ins with this lass about half an hour apart, just to confirm what you already thought from that first occurrence was information the audience was already supposed to know. Add to that just a lot of meandering and scenes that go on a little too long. The romance subplot is just like, there. It really adds nothing. The whole film could honestly be about half an hour, if not even 40 minutes shorter. It's got real pacing issues. Which is a shame, because when it's good, it's good. There's some real meat there. It's just a bit too spread thin. Lots to love, it just requires a bit more digging than maybe should be necessary. Would I personally recommend it? It depends on your patience for this kind of thing. I actually really like this movie in spite of its flaws, but if you're not one for slow films, maybe give it a miss. But if you think you're willing to just spend a bit of time with solid theming and good characters in its moody atmosphere and soundscapes, even if you know it's going to tread water quite a bit, then absolutely give it a shot. If nothing else, it's a very interesting curiosity for the franchise it's in, and for my money, in spite of its flaws, it's actually one of the best sequels. I don't know if that's a hot take or anything, but that's where I stand with it. It's a lot better than some of the stuff that comes next, if you ask me. So after Halloween 3 was considered a flop, the producers in the studio weren't going to make the same mistake twice, and Halloween 4 was going to feature Michael Myers front and centre. And they could not make their intentions more clear. I mean, it's right there in the title. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Was it a triumphant return? Halloween 4 marks the introduction of probably my least favourite time period in the franchise, the much discussed and massively divisive Thorn trilogy, which would see the franchise double down on the more occult aspects of the Michael Myers character hinted at in Halloween 2, and you all know how I felt about that stuff. Having said that, while Halloween 4 is considered part of this trilogy due to a through line of Laurie Strode's daughter being the protagonist we follow in all 3 films, it's only with the next movie that we get into the really weird stuff. And Halloween 4, for all its faults, has the decency to play things pretty straight. Michael's back in Haddonfield, he's a killer, he's hard as nails, and he wants to kill his niece. That's as complicated as we get. It's nice, simple, and not too contrived. Unfortunately though, even with the benefit of it being pretty straight-laced, which is an approach I have always personally preferred for the Michael Myers character, the film lacks the involvement of a lot of the people that once made it special. I've already detailed in depth in my last video how series creators John Carpenter and Deborah Hill felt about Michael Myers based sequels, and presumably based on a lot of those strong feelings, they didn't stick around long for this one. Halloween 3, as I said yesterday, was supposed to make the series change track into an anthology series. The next film was meant to be a ghost story, but after 3's weak returns, those plans got completely scrapped, and Michael was coming back regardless of whether his creators wanted him to or not. Even after Michael's return was decided though, Carpenter and Hill weren't immediately off the project. Carpenter was offered to write and direct, and Hill had planned to produce for a brief period. Carpenter even went so far as to write the script with prolific fantasy and horror author Dennis Etchison, who had some experience in the franchise, having written the novelizations of Halloween 2 and 3 under a pseudonym. But when he got the script in the hands of producer Mustafa Akkad said it was too cerebral. And honestly, I'm actually surprisingly on Akkad's side with this one. The script found its way online, and having flicked through it, it's got some cool ideas, but it's a bit out there. Though at one point, Joe Dante of Gremlins fame was first choice to direct this version, which could have been interesting. Ultimately though, its concepts are just a bit too bizarre for my taste. In the script, the town of Haddonfield has banned Halloween as a celebration, which is actually an idea they'd revisit in Halloween 6. There's like a surreal dream sequence where a little girl in a house made of flesh splits in two and Michael emerges from her. He has like regenerative abilities in this one. He loses 2 fingers and then they grow back on screen while he holds the film reels of a Friday the 13th movie in his hands. And near the end, Michael grows to be a 12-foot tall monster. It's maybe with some reworking a decent script for a character like Freddy Krueger, but it's not a Michael Myers story. Akkad wanted a flesh and blood killer, a total back to basics approach, and while I think this was absolutely the right direction if a Halloween 4 had to exist, Carpenter and Hill by this point were just so done with the franchise and sold any intellectual connection they had to the title. With Carpenter out of the picture, Dwight H. Little, who previously worked on the Nightmare on Elm Street series because these big horror slasher icons apparently exist in a strangely insular world, came on as his directorial replacement. Due to the impending writer's strike, a script was quickly bashed out from concept to finished draft in less than 11 days by debut screenwriter Alan B. McElroy. And after some revisions, they went into production and came out the other end with the Halloween 4 we now know, and it's okay. I really don't want to go into it too hard on this one, partly because 1, it has some stuff I really like, 2, I know this one actually has a pretty big fan base and a lot of people really love this entry, and 3, I do honestly believe it's one of the better sequels. I certainly prefer it to what's left to come in this trilogy, but I'm hard pressed to say I enjoy it. On paper, I don't actually have all that many issues with it. The plot is pretty solid. I mean, it's a basic straight slasher formula, but so was the first film and I adore that one. It's more in its execution that I kinda lose steam on it. So the film starts off really promising, opening on a beautifully realised farm in October with production design that immediately evokes the Halloween season. A particularly impressive feat considering this was actually shot in April. The filmmakers had to bulk import in leaves and paint gourds orange to resemble pumpkins, but it really pays off. There's not a hint of fakeness about it, and when paired with all the fun Halloween decorations, it really sets a nice mood. We then cut to Michael. Following on from the ending of Halloween 2 and completely ignoring 3 for obvious reasons, it's been 10 years since the night of his first slaughter, and Michael is in a comatose state and is being transferred from his current hospital to another sanitarium. He's seemingly as still as they come, until during the transfer one of the attendants with him mentions that he has a niece, which causes him to burst into life and kill them, causing the ambulance to crash and he is able to escape. So yeah, as already covered, Michael's got a niece in this one and that's his motivation. He wants to interact with / kill her. Now if you've watched my previous vids on this franchise you might think I'd hate this, but strangely I do not. I know I've expressed a strong distaste for Michael's familial connections being his motivators before and that I prefer him to just be a random and senseless killer because that's way scarier. However, I do also feel that since the Laurie being his sister thing is kind of out there now and you're making a sequel specifically to the film that established that, him emerging from his state to seek out another blood relative is fine. It's as good a reason as any for him to get up and kicking again at this point. The fact that he's actively seeking a child raises the emotional stake, and it helps that Danielle Harris, who plays Jamie Lloyd, Laurie's daughter, is fucking incredible in this role. Holy shit, this kid can act! This isn't just good for a child performer, this is just really good acting in general. When she's terrified in this in the next film, my heart fucking sinks for her. She is so believable as this frightened little girl that she instantly garners my every bit of empathy. Like, if anything happened to this kid, I'd be ready to throw fucking hands at Maya's. It'd probably end with a result that looks similar to the boxing match that went down in Friday 8, but my intention would be there, and that's what matters. I would die for this kid, she's fantastic. Anyway, with Michael out wandering, ya boy, Dr. Loomis, who somehow survived the explosion at the end of Halloween 2 and came away with nothing more than magical burn scars that constantly change shot to shot, is once again ready to drop a motherfucker. Immediately springing into action the second he hears about Michael's possible escape, before he even has confirmation that the bodies in the wreckage aren't his. He tracks Michael to a gas station in a pretty cool and genuinely pretty tense scene where he walks amongst the aftermath of the beginning of Michael's killing spree, not sure if he's still around. It turns out Michael is still there, and he escapes in a truck, blowing up the gas station in the process, which wrecks Loomis's car. Yeah, this film has a budget of $5 million, and I think they want us to know that. Basically, every entry after that first film has a bit more cash to work with and ends up using it to be a lot more actiony and a lot less subtle. And although this film has its moments, that approach still generally applies here. Anyway, we then meet the previously mentioned Jamie Lloyd, who is Laurie, our Jamie Lee Curtis played original Final Girl's daughter. Laurie is dead, by the way, in this timeline. She's not in others, but we'll get to the weird choose-your-own-adventure-esque continuity of the series when it becomes relevant later. In this version of the story, she died in a car accident sometime between the events of Halloween 2 and this film. And if you've watched my previous videos where I go in hard on slasher movies quickly killing main cast from previous films, you might think that I would hate this. But I really don't. It's different when it's a death that happens off screen during some massive time gap between films. It doesn't really feel like they're using Laurie as needless cannon fodder, like it did with the Dream Warriors in Nightmare 4 or Alice in Friday 2. And it's not like this wasn't born out of actual necessity, as Jamie Lee Curtis's career had ballooned at this point and she politely turned down the role to pursue other projects. Would I have liked a better death for her than a car accident? Maybe, but it serves a purpose in giving her daughter some emotional baggage. So Jamie is living with her caring foster family, the Caruthers. That's parents Richard and Darlene and their teenage daughter Rachel. While she's well looked after here, Jamie is still troubled, missing her biological mother and feeling like an outsider in the family despite seemingly positive relationships with all of them. Jamie has nightmares about Michael somehow, and that doesn't quite add up for me. I know she knows about him, but I don't think she'd have ever seen him. I mean, she doesn't recognise that it's him who she's dreaming about, only ever referring to him as the Nightmare Man, so there's some disconnect there. I don't know, maybe she saw like a news program or something and filed it away in her subconscious somewhere. This doesn't bother me too much really, to be honest. It's just a strange little element I thought worth mentioning. Moving on, when Halloween hits, Rachel is stuck with babysitting Jamie when she had a hot date with hunky boyfriend Brady planned. But after initial complaints, she's a good sport about it when she realises her protesting has upset her younger foster sister. She takes Jamie out for ice cream in a Halloween costume and Michael happens to arrive at the same store, stealing a mask and revealing himself to Jamie. But he leaves when she screams and alerts others to his presence. Rachel goes to comfort her, but when she tells Rachel that she saw the Nightmare Man, Rachel just puts it down to the little and scaring herself when she caught a glimpse of a mask or something. Speaking of masks, let's talk about the one Michael just stole. It looks fucking shit! What is this? Why is this? What was wrong with his original mask design? The dude looked excellent in films 1 and 2, and that shit was done on the cheap. It was just a William Shatner mask with the eyes widened and spray painted white and with modified hair. And yet that, which was based on a mask that was bought at a cheap costume novelty store, does not look anywhere near as cheap and novelty costume-esque as this. Why is it so blonde looking? Is it blonde? I can't tell. In some shots it looks blonde. Oh wait, that's actually because this film used multiple masks for reshoots and only one of them was blonde. What? And those eyebrows, man, they just look so drawn on. The dude always looks like you caught him stealing your snacks from the fridge, and he's perpetually caught in that awkward moment afterwards where he doesn't know what to say. There's like no definition to this thing, it makes it look so flat. The first one had so much more texture to it. There was definition in the cheekbones. Halloween 4's mask looks like the budget version of that mask you'd get in a fancy dress pack or in a Poundland. I just hate how he looks in this one. I struggle to take him seriously, it's just not scary. It looks bad. I realise aesthetic is purely subjective. I imagine a lot of people really like this design and for them maybe it looks more intense, but to me, it just looks like a cartoony cosplay of the character rather than the iconic killer himself. I mean, it's not like it kills the movie or anything, but it really takes me out of the moment in some shots. Especially in the lighting of his immediate next kill where he goes to a power station. The washed out tones of this scene do nothing for him. It makes him look even more cartoonish. Speaking of this scene though, we should probably carry on with the plot summary. So Michael throws this dude into a generator which causes the town to go into a blackout while Rachel and Jamie are out trick-or-treating. Loomis meanwhile eventually gets into town after hitching a ride with a very interesting fella, and warns the new sheriff that Michael might be in town too. Which is quickly confirmed when they go back to the police station and discover everybody dead. A bunch of blokes show up at the station demanding answers when a TV news bulletin from the sheriff issued a curfew due to Michael being on the prowl. The sheriff tries to calm them down, but that mad lovable bastard Dr. Loomis is just like, "Go fucking crazy lads, Michael's back!" and riles up their red-blooded gun-toting machismo, creating a lynch mob. The sheriff is like, "What the fuck did you do that for?" And Loomis is like, "Well mate, you've got no coppers, they're all canny dead, so better to have something." The lynch mob is cool in concept, but they don't do nearly enough with them. Like, there's a bit that's really quite interesting where they go absolutely trigger happy on a figure in the distance thinking it's Michael, and they're just totally wrong and accidentally kill one of their friends. And you're like, oh, holy shit, that's interesting. Is that going to be explored at all? Are we going to see how these guys feel about that afterwards? Maybe in the next instance they actually do see Michael, but they're all too afraid to pull the trigger just in case they're wrong again until it's too late. Are we maybe going to explore a theme here with how vigilante violence is just as dangerous a threat as the violence of the killer? Might they foolishly rack up a similar body count? There's lots of things you could do with this, especially after opening up this concept with such a shocking initial punch. But the next scene you see them in, they all just die. Michael just kills pretty much all of them. There is a little bit of that is caused by a kind of trigger trepidation. They decide to let the police handle things and just take the girls they find to safety instead of continuing the hunt. But it's not quite as cause and effect as I'd like it to be, you know what I mean? Like, I think it would have been a much more satisfying setup and payoff if it was the guy who wrongly called out that he saw Michael when they accidentally shot their friend, physically hesitating from pulling the trigger when confronted with Michael in front of him. Plus, I just think they should have stuck around longer and caused more problems. Really cool concept, just goes mostly underutilized. I will say though, the lynch mob leader gets a cool death. His neck gets all twisted apart and stuff. Pretty good visual, pretty good effects. And interestingly, this wasn't in the original cut. After viewing the roughs, the director and producer thought, needs more violence. So they had a whole extra day of blood filming, where they brought in John Carl Buechler. Yep, the Friday 8 director and Nightmare effects artist. Man, these slashers are so insular. And they got him to do added visuals on this kill and this really gnarly thumb through the forehead death that happens elsewhere. I'm jumping ahead of myself with that one though. There's some stuff after the lynch mob form but before they kill their mate and die where we get the inclusion of some romantic drama. Rachel finds out her boyfriend is banging the sheriff's daughter and I don't really care for this little love triangle thing. Like, the actors are all good, it's not particularly badly written or anything, it's just not that interesting. Well actually, now that I think about it, some of it is really badly written.
Wise up to what men want, Rachel. Or Brady won't be the last man you lose to another woman.
This is how women talk. This whole affair does give Rachel an excuse to get distracted and allow Jamie to wander off though, and when the girls are separated on the dark streets we get to have some nice tension building stuff. A weird bit during all this though is when for a moment 3 Michael Myers pop out and you're like, wait, what? But it's just some kids in costume pulling a prank. Kinda takes you out of it, that bit. At least it did for me. The sight of 3 Michaels is more confusing than scary, and then when it turns out to just be a prank, it's kind of an eye-rolling moment. Anyway, eventually Loomis and the sheriff find the girls and take them to the sheriff's house for safety, and to wrap this all up quick, the rest of the movie, bar the lynch mob tangent, plays out like you'd expect, with Michael killing until he's finally stopped in some dramatic manner, and our 2 leading ladies survive. More specifically, he gets in the house, kills most of the people there, including one he shoves a shotgun through, brilliant, but he's unable to get at our protagonist. There is a really cool bit where they escape on the roof that genuinely looks legitimately dangerous, and then afterwards they're chased through a school and picked up by the aforementioned lynch mob. The girls try to escape on a truck out of town with the mob, but Michael is apparently hanging on the underside of the truck Cape Fear style. He emerges and starts killing everyone until Rachel takes control of the vehicle and throws Michael from it. The state police arrive on the scene and Michael is presumed dead. That is, until Jamie goes and touches his hand and he surfaces. Until the police, and actually some surviving lynch mob members, shoot the shit out of him. So I guess this mob was a good thing? I don't know what this film wants me to think about the lynch mob. It doesn't really seem to have a stance on them. Michael falls down a mine from the blasts, and that's the last we see of him this film. And the film ends there on a nice victorious note. Only no it doesn't! In one of the movie's most memorable moments, the film actually ends on a very bleak note, where Loomis and the sheriff take the girls back home, but when their mother is running a bath for Jamie, she is stabbed by an unseen attacker, from the same voyeuristic perspective the first Halloween opened on. And the big reveal? It's not Michael, it's fucking Jamie! All decked out in a clown outfit similar to her uncle's costume during his first killing when he was her age. Man, they grow up so fast. Wild ending, completely out of left field, genuinely properly shocking. Also, I can't decide if it's really dramatic and harrowing, or just really funny, that Dr. Loomis's first instinct is to scream no, and desperately try to shoot the child. I fucking love this dude, man. He is so trigger happy. Like, don't get me wrong, exceptional performance in that moment, just the absolute despair and desperation on his face, and the utter defeat when he sinks to the ground sobbing. Amazing stuff. But also he did just try to shoot a 6-year-old. I'm sorry, I know that shouldn't be funny, but like, kinda is though, innit? Just like, first instinct, no hesitation, he was just like, shit, gotta kill this 6-year-old now, gotta do it, there's no other options. That's wild. And that is Halloween 4. Now obviously there's a lot to love about this thing. It's obvious just from the synopsis. It's got a great atmosphere, it's got some fun slasher kills, it's got great performances, and there's a lot of interesting threads unique to this movie, like the mob, the level of ferocity at which Michael kills in this one. I mean, dude goes through an entire police station, and of course, that crazy ending. Very memorable final punch on this one. And one that sticks in strongly with the original film's themes, this kind of idea that you just can't kill evil. But on the other hand, I don't know how to articulate this better, but a lot of it's just dull. I know it doesn't sound like it would be from the plot summary. I mean, there's a healthy peppering of kills and unique elements, but I don't know, I can't tell you exactly what it is, but watching the film for this video, I found the pacing really slow. The film felt very long to me, despite only going for 90 minutes, and while there was certainly a lot of elements I liked, the sum of their parts just never quite clicked for me. I found that a lot of the time it felt like a rehash of the far better original. Like, there was tension building scenes where I thought, okay, that scene was kinda good, kinda more in line with the tone I want from Halloween, but I never felt tense because of them. Like, I could fall asleep watching this if I had to. It's not exactly nerve-wracking. And the more unique aspects were either bad, like the love triangle, went nowhere interesting, like the mob, or felt unearned, and this is probably where I'm going to piss a lot of people off, like the ending. Don't get me wrong, the ending made me sit up and take notice. In a film that sort of felt like it just kind of passed over my eyes without me really feeling anything for it, the ending evoked a reaction. I was shocked. It reminded me of the first movie's opening, which is obviously what they were going for, but also, after the initial shock of it had died down, it didn't sit with me right. The film does nothing to really earn this. Half of the reason that it's so surprising is that it kind of comes out of nowhere, and that feels a little cheap. Jamie shows, as far as I could tell, absolutely no signs whatsoever of being capable of this, and there was an opportunity to put it in there. She gets bullied at school by other kids who make fun of her for her famously violent uncle. Maybe she could have lost her temper and hit one. You know, just maybe hint at that violent tendency. Maybe she could have been weird with her sister, displayed some erratic mood bursts, just enough to plant the seed while not giving away the ending. But besides sticking her in a clown costume reminiscent of her uncle's, the film does nothing to foreshadow this. And for me, that clown costume simply isn't enough. It's totally unearned. Shocking only really because it's hugely out of character and a child is committing the violence. I know people love this ending, so I'm really sorry to bag on it like this. I don't mean to sour anyone's sweet, but it just feels kinda cheap to me. There is so little to set up what Jamie does in the final act that I've seen explanations online suggest that the reason she kills at the end is because she touched Michael's hand and he magically shifted his evil intent into her. And listen, I mean this in the nicest possible way. Fuck off! No! No way! Surely that can't have been what they were going for, because if it is, that makes the ending even worse. That is pure mumbo-jumbo nonsense with no setup. Sure, there was a thematic thread in the first film of like, you can't kill evil, but that's taking metaphorical language a bit too literally, isn't it? Evil isn't like some body-swapping immortal force. This isn't Jason Goes to Hell. It just doesn't land with me. The film in general doesn't land with me. And I'm kinda shocked to find myself saying this when there's individual elements I think are really cool in isolation. I mean, little Danielle Harris's performance alone is one of my favourite in slashers period, and definitely one of my favourite child actor performances. But I don't know, just when you put all these parts together, it just doesn't feel right to me. I wish it did, but for whatever reason, it's not clicking. Would I personally recommend it? Not really. But I would recommend that you ignore me and watch it anyway and make your own decision, because there's a lot of good stuff in there and a lot of people really love this one, and you might be one of them. It just happens to be that I'm not. And that's okay. Sometimes some things are just not for you. And while I don't like Halloween 4, I can respect its better parts, admire what it tries to do, and like I've already said, it's a lot better than the stuff that comes next. Speaking of, Halloween 5 has the subtitle The Revenge of Michael Myers, and apparently I must have done something to really piss him off, because his revenge comes in the form of boring me to tears. Okay, so that was a cruel opening line. I take no joy in tearing art down, even the stuff that I don't like. I'm not going to repeat myself, I've gave you this speech before earlier in this month multiple times now, but look, there really is not a lot for me to like with Halloween 5. As I mentioned yesterday, we're in what's known as the Thorn trilogy years of this slasher's career. 3 films back to back that introduced the positive of new lead character Jamie, a young child and Michael's nephew, who is brilliantly acted in the first 2 entries by Danielle Harris, but also doubled down a lot on the parts of the character that I enjoyed the least. A contrived and supernatural backstory that adds occult elements to an otherwise mostly grounded character. Now, Halloween 4 wasn't to my taste, as I've already mentioned, but it was commendable at least in how it kept all that overcomplicated mumbo-jumbo stuff completely out of the way. Series producer Mustafa Akkad wanted a back-to-basics slasher film, with a grounded human villain, and on that level at least, it delivered. It is bizarre then, that after the commercial success of Halloween 4, for some reason, they did a complete 180 on this simplistic approach and introduced a telepathic link between Michael and his niece, planted the seeds for a cult that revolved around the druidic symbol of Thorn, which is how the trilogy got its name, and introduced a mysterious man in black connected to all of this to set up a larger secondary villain. Why would you do this? Mustafa Akkad credited the back-to-basics approach of 4 as being one of the key elements to its commercial success. So, what the hell? Well, the reason this is all here is deeply unsatisfying. There's no like madly misguided but well-meaning intentions at the centre of it all. There's no big series plans to come up this had to set up that just didn't pan out. There's no aggrandized auteur that insisted on the changes. It's simply because this shit was rushed. Akkad wanted a film quick, and they started principal photography on this film while the original screenplay was still going through revision cycles. The first draft sounded more interesting at least. A writer known as Shem Bitterman expanded on 4's bleak ending by having Jamie Lloyd, our young protagonist who stabbed her foster mother in that film's final twist, become full evil for this one. For whatever reason though, his idea was thrown out by a card in the studio. Maybe they thought that a child serial killer might be too controversial or hard to believe for a whole film, or maybe they just got cold feet on making anyone but Michael the main murderer after Halloween 3 drastically underperformed. Whatever the reason, director Dominique Athena Gerard and Michael Jacobs were brought in to do rewrites. There's a pretty bold story of Dominique getting the gig after apparently throwing the script they gave him in the trash in front of a card and his team, but other than that, production was pretty standard, just, you know, on fast forward, which meant the final screenplay was more than a little unpolished. Somewhere along the lines, there was apparently an actual effort to minimise the supernatural aspects. There was a lot more druidic cult stuff earlier in production, but that stuff got filtered out. However, because supernatural elements are still in the final production, just in a less significant role, this only served to confuse the audience further, as it just means that a lot of it goes unexplained, especially the aforementioned mysterious man in black that appears near the end of the movie, who even the filmmakers had no idea about, putting the guy in there and figuring they'd just work out his role in all of this in the next movie. The whole thing is just a real hack job through and through. Rushed out the door, junky in execution, and already setting up sequels with no idea what those films will even look like. I don't know if this is coming across, but needless to say, I'm not too keen on this one. I suppose we should cover what it's all about though. So the film starts in the previous film's final act. Michael is shot and falls down a mine shaft, only this time we see a bit more of what happened after. As the sheriff and lynch mob hoy dynamite down after him to finish him off, Michael is able to crawl to a nearby creek and save himself. Stumbling away from the site of his near-death experience, he comes across an elderly hermit who, I guess unfamiliar with the legacy of the man who has fallen into his lap, nurses Michael back to health after he falls into a coma. If you're thinking it's a little weird that this guy doesn't contact the hospital or anything, or that he's somehow prepared to care for a comatose patient for what ends up being a whole year despite his secluded lifestyle, that's because this is more or less a reskinned artifact of the old, more supernatural script. Originally, this guy was supposed to be a member of the Cult of Thorn, who resurrected Michael for, I don't know, cult reasons. But lacking this more out there story beat, they still needed something to bring back Michael, so they kept his resurrection, if you will, but just grounded it a bit more in reality. Which is an odd choice when you consider very shortly after this, the film introduces the plot point of psychic familial links. A year later, Michael awakens and kills his unfortunate carer, and this then brings us to the Haddonfield Children's Clinic, the site where Jamie was admitted to after she stabbed her foster mom in the fourth film's closing events. Her mom survived, by the way, which was probably written in as an element to keep our innocent lead still likeable. It'd be harder to root for her after all had she actually committed murder, even if she was just a child. That said though, because this is the direction they went with and not an evil Jamie, doesn't that kind of undermine the whole shock ending of 4? Which is often the thing that fans and even critics point out to as the best element of that movie. I know they probably wanted Michael to be the main focus, but this feels really flat, doesn't it? It's toothless. There is very little consequence to Jamie's actions at the end of that last movie now. Like, they introduced that she's mute now, but that feels more to do with her general trauma surrounding Michael as opposed to being related to her attack on her foster mother. And sure, she's in a children's clinic, but like, that's it. It hasn't even really strained her relationship with her family seemingly, as her foster sister Rachel visits her in hospital regularly and has no trepidations around her whatsoever. Which I don't mind, to be fair. I actually think that's kind of sweet that her sister still just treats her like the little girl she is and doesn't feel like she has to step on eggshells around her in case of a sudden and random violent outburst. But man, if this doesn't feel like a flat and uninteresting way to write around a huge dramatic plot beat. It just feels like they were happy to have the shock ending of 4, but damn did they not want to deal with the consequences of it. It's such a shame too, as despite the issues I personally have with 4's ending that I went into in my last vid, there's no denying it's kind of a big deal and it's a huge dramatic point to kick off into potentially new and interesting stories from. Ignoring it feels so risk averse. But then they start introducing lame supernatural stuff in this one, so they couldn't have been that opposed to risk. This isn't just a me thing as well, even some of the cast were baffled by this. The fantastic Donald Pleasance, who once again returned as Dr. Loomis, found this decision totally wrong. In an interview with Fangoria, he said, "This director has a lot of imagination and is very clever, but I don't think he understands that he's making the 5th film in a series rather than his own idea of what the film should be. I haven't agreed with a lot of what he has done with the film. So we talk and come to compromises. I think they should have gone along with the fact that the little girl is now totally evil. I was disappointed that we now discover she did not kill her mother at the end of the last film." And he's totally right, isn't he? This feels like a retcon. A lot of the drama of that final scene comes from the assumption that Jamie has killed her mother and now she just hasn't? Takes a lot of the wind out of that ending sails. I get that Akkad and the studio probably wanted a lot of focus on Michael. They were real keen not to make the Halloween 3 mistake again. But like, there's a way to still give Jamie's actions consequences and have a huge Michael focus too. This didn't have to be a choose one or the other kind of deal. Actress Danielle Harris, who plays Jamie in Halloween 4 and 5, actually had what I think was an absolutely class idea. Although she's kind of went back on it now, she had said in the past that she thought as a kid that she was going to be the killer of this one, or maybe even Michael's little sidekick. And man, when I read that last part, my brain just started filling with ideas. Yeah, it's pulpy as all hell to give this iconic screen presence a little mini-me, but at this point, the series was pulpy. It was far from the critical darling the original was, and in a way that's kind of freeing. When you're not chasing critical acclaim and are more concerned with just making fun, entertaining and profitable slashers a la Friday the 13th, why not have some fun with it? Imagine for a moment a story where Michael comes back not to kill Jamie, but to take her under his wing. I fucking love the image of this tall murder man holding hands with this little clown child over a body they both just slaughtered. It's an almost Burton-esque visual, so weirdly fun and morbid. And it's such a new and interesting dynamic. How many slasher films can you think of had a murder Batman and a little Robin he was teaching the ways of the trade? It could have been a really fun story, one that made Michael's strange familial obsession a lot more interesting. Okay, fuck it. I genuinely didn't intend for this to be in this video when I started it, but I'm pitching again. This is a corny, pulpy and campy suggestion, but I kinda love it. It'll be quick this time though, I promise. Okay, so, Michael survives at the end of Halloween 4 and disappears for a bit. We'll keep that the same. Jamie is still in the children's hospital, and she's doing all the things Dr. Loomis once saw Michael do. She's just dead behind the eyes, completely transfixed on nearby walls. Nothing seems to get through to her. Loomis and the hospital staff completely write her off, with Loomis even campaigning to have her put in maximum security, much to her sister Rachel's protest, who is still protective of her sister despite Jamie having killed their mother. Basically, everyone on the planet writes this kid off apart from Rachel, and sometimes during Rachel's visits, Jamie shows a little humanity. Just tiny things, but Rachel sees them. She'll make a joke and she'll see a hint of a childish innocent smirk. She'll touch Jamie's hand and Jamie will gently grip back. And she'll tell the doctors and Loomis about this, but they'll just dismiss her. Tell her she's too attached. Tell her she's just like her uncle, that there's nothing there. Anyway, a year later when Michael heals from his wounds, keep the hermit in, I don't care, or send him to a hospital despite Loomis's protest and have him protected by the state in maximum security while he pulls himself together. Whatever happens, he resurfaces and he escapes and heads back to Haddonfield to continue what he started. He catches a news report announcing his escape, and just as he's about to leave and carry on with his latest spree, perhaps even hunt down his niece, something uncharacteristically catches his attention. They mention in the report about his niece killing her foster mother and being kept in the hospital, and he pauses. He tilts his head in that way he rarely does sometimes, that never really betrays exactly what he's thinking, and as an image of his smiling pre-murderer status niece comes up on the screen, he gently reaches out and touches the glass. His pale, emotionless mask not telling us for certain what he means with this, but the gentle touch almost suggesting a sense of kinship? Of familiarity, perhaps? Whatever's happening there, he knows his next moves and makes his way to the hospital. Jamie sits in her room, unflinching and unreactive to the terrified cries and screams outside that suggest her uncle's arrival. Michael smashes the door to her open, the Halloween theme that plays to mark his arrival, suggesting he's out for violence. She does not react to his presence, other than to look over in his direction. She is not scared. She does not attempt to flee. She just observes him. He walks, knife in hand, to the foot of her bed and pauses for a moment, The music is tense, the two observe one another, and Michael extends an open palm. Jamie considers it, her face expressionless, giving us little knowledge as to what she is thinking. And then suddenly, just as the huge crescendo in the track hits, Jamie places her hand in his, the theme continuing as the two walk hand in hand through the bodies of the staff that line the floor of the hospital. We cut to a costume store closing up for Halloween night. A member of staff sends away what he thinks is the last customer before locking up, only to hear someone in the back by the changing rooms. He shouts out that they're closing, and when he goes to investigate, he finds Jamie all alone. He asks her if she's okay, says, "Do you have any parents I could call? Is there anyone looking after you?" "Yeah, there is, and it's Michael fucking Myers." He emerges from behind the changing room curtain and stabs the dude half to death, before turning to Jamie, already now in the clown costume she wore when she committed her first kill, but with the mask resting on top of her head. Michael hands her his knife. The staff member, bleeding out, crawls weakly over to the little girl, begging her, pleading her to run and get help. She simply lowers the mask and stabs him in the throat, completing her transformation into Michael's little sidekick. She hands her uncle back the knife and he picks her up and walks out the shop with her. News gets back to Rachel and Loomis of what happened at the hospital, and they react very differently. Rachel is terrified for her sister and is determined to find and save her. Loomis is more of the opinion that evil has taken an apprentice, which would definitely be the film's tagline, by the way, and there's just another thing out there that needs to be put in the ground. The two begin their search for Michael and Jamie, Rachel determined to find Jamie first before Loomis gets to her and shows the young girl no mercy. Meanwhile, Michael and Jamie continue their slaughter, and they're having a real easy time with it because guess what? It's Halloween night and they just look like a kid and her caring uncle going out trick-or-treating. We play with this dynamic a lot, having scenes like Jamie knock on the door and when the homeowner answers and talks to her like any other kid, complimenting her on her wonderful clown costume, Michael storms in the house and starts slaughtering, often with Jamie getting in on the action. As this dynamic plays out, we also notice how it changes Michael. Though his kills start off as emotionally distant as always, when one of their potential victims draws a knife in self-defense on Jamie, something fucking uncharacteristically snaps in him. He doesn't just kill this person, he destroys them, breaking their hand and then smashing them repeatedly and angrily into a nearby wall in a kill that feels far more emotive than anything he has done in his past. He even immediately checks on Jamie afterwards. Though his face obviously doesn't show it, the audience has suggested through his actions that he's grown extremely protective of his niece. As Michael and Jamie continue their slaughter, Loomis is the first to catch up with them, but as he draws his gun on Jamie, Rachel jumps in and pushes the gun into the air as he fires. Jamie, of course, doesn't react, but we linger on her, observing Rachel fighting for her. As Rachel struggles with Loomis and his gun, she screams at her little sister to flee, and Jamie actually listens to her and turns to run, but as she does so, she goes straight into Michael's legs. She looks up at him, he looks down at her, and then towards Loomis and Rachel. He walks past his niece and stabs Loomis in the back, who falls off to the side. Then he turns his attention to Rachel. He begins to strangle her. Loomis is down and fading. Rachel is losing consciousness. As she struggles to break free of Michael's grasp, she looks around for something to aid her, but there's nothing. It's all over and she knows it. With her last breath, she looks at her little sister, standing there, unassumingly with a knife in her hand, watching all of this unfold with a passive expression. And with her last breath, Rachel begs her to run, to save herself. Just as Rachel is about to fade, suddenly a knife plunges into Michael's leg. He drops Rachel and stumbles in pain. He turns to see his attacker and finds his niece's hand on the knife handle. For a moment, he does not know what to do. The confusion gives Rachel time to grab Loomis's gun and shoot Michael as many times as possible, emptying the entire clip. As he falls back and begins to bleed out, his niece walks over to him. She looks at him, dying in front of her, and his gaze meets hers. She removes her mask, symbolising her severing that connection to her uncle. Michael's hand raises up. It almost looks as if he would choke his niece for her betrayal. But as he reaches her face, his palm opens. He rests it on her cheek gently. He forgives her. She holds his hand by her face as he passes, until her sister pulls her away and holds her close. Loomis, regaining consciousness, watches this all unfold, and as he observes Rachel and Jamie, he sees the little girl he had once written off. He smiles gently. Perhaps she can be saved, after all. Okay, pitch over. Sorry, that one was kind of rushed. Point is, you can do a Jamie and Michael story without adding supernatural elements and without undermining your previous film's ending. Wow! I'm not saying that idea is crazy polished or anything. I literally came up with it as I was writing this video, so it's like a 5-minute thought. But the point is, the filmmakers didn't have to choose between the two characters, that's all. Apologies for that massive and unnecessary tangent. Let's get back to the actual movie's plot now. Jamie is at Haddonfield Hospital and is displaying signs of a telepathic link to Michael. Loomis becomes aware of this and is convinced that means Michael is alive, and gets real angry at this mute child when she won't cooperate and tell him exactly where he is. I do not like this Loomis. I find him extremely hard to root for in this one because of the way he treats Jamie. He's pretty awful. Back with Michael, we begin to follow him as he starts his next killing spree. His first stop? Jamie's foster sister Rachel! I would scream into a pillow right now, but if I do, I know that all my makeup will come off on it. Fucking hate this. I'm not going to repeat myself too much because I've already went in hard on Friday 2's treatment of first film's final girl Alice and Nightmare 4's treatment of the Dream Warriors, but for God's sake, what is with slasher movies treating major characters like fucking expendable cannon fodder? I absolutely despise this. It's so infuriating and completely undermines that character's previous narrative victories. This sucks so much. Apparently, they originally planned to make her death way more brutal too and have Michael stab scissors down her throat. But Rachel's actress Ellie Cornell was really disappointed to find out her character was going to be killed off in such an unceremonious manner after playing such a big part in 4 that she only agreed to do this 5th film if they gave her a pay raise and rewrote her death to be less brutal. Small silver lining, I guess, that the actress got paid a bit more to put up with this bullshit, but man is this still infuriating. I can only assume this and the lack of utilising Jamie's ending from 4 in an interesting way was just a symptom of its shitty rush production. Maybe with more time they might have done something more compelling or rewarding here, but whatever, this is what we got. God, I really just do not like this film. Anyway, Michael carries on doing Michael things and picks a new lady to stalk, namely Rachel's friend Tina. He kills Tina's boyfriend Mike and steals the mask Tina had given to him as a Halloween present, which does give us an admittedly somewhat cool sequence where Tina is picked up by a man she believes to be her boyfriend but is actually Michael in disguise, and you're spending the whole sequence waiting for either Michael to snap or her to realise who she's in the car with. Based on a warning given by Jamie though from her psychic connection to Michael, the police are able to get to her first before Michael is able to kill her, and he leaves before they can click on that he's there. While all this is going on, Jamie and her friend Billy, another kid from the clinic, are taken out for Halloween night as a special treat, and Tina, against the police who have been assigned to guard her wishes, goes with some friends to a Halloween party at a farm. While performing at a costume competition, Jamie's psychic connection to Michael warns her that Tina is in danger, and Tina and Billy go to warn her. Michael kills some of Tina's mates after they go to have sex in a barn, but Tina is able to escape as Jamie and Billy arrive on the scene. Michael begins to chase Jamie down in a car, which I guess to the movie's credit is kind of intense, what with her being a little kid and all, but he crashes into a tree, and in a genuinely pretty sweet and selfless moment, Tina, who was previously shown to care very much about Jamie, allows the kids some time to escape by sacrificing herself. Loomis arrives on the scene to find Jamie, and together they decide to stop Michael with a final plan. The two, along with Town Sheriff Mika, set up a staged scenario/trap kind of thing with the intent to draw Michael out and kill him. It's a pretty farcical setup that sees Jamie mimicking the actions of Michael's sister Judith from the first film. She's sat at her mirror at the old Maya's house combing through her hair and like, is this necessary? Who is this for, really? It kinda doesn't sit right with me as well because this kid is 6 and she's mimicking the actions of a teenager who just had sex with her boyfriend and was partially naked during the events she's imitating. Don't get me wrong, they don't do anything dodgy with the kid here, the sexual aspect of the original scene isn't really brought up, but it still just feels a little bit off. I don't know, I just don't vibe with it. I also don't understand how this draws Michael out any more than her just, you know, being there? Surely he's coming to kill her anyway. What does this achieve? Whatever the case, Michael does eventually arrive, and Loomis uncharacteristically tries to reason with him, and I'm sorry, what the fuck? Since when has trigger-happy Loomis ever wanted to reason with this guy? This goes completely against our understanding of their dynamic. In the first film, he's depicted as seeing Michael as so inhuman, he only ever refers to him as it. And this sudden change of heart also makes his impatience with Jamie earlier in the film even less sympathetic, because now it wasn't the desperate pleas of a man who wanted nothing more than to see this monster dead and buried, but the actions of a man who still saw Michael as a human patient. I don't buy it. And apparently, neither does Michael, who chucks Loomis over the stair banister. There's a bit of a pursuit of Jamie as the film draws to its final act. Dead dog warning at this point, by the way, just in case you're thinking of watching and this is a big no-no for you, as I know it is for a lot of people. And then we get an almost compelling, if not completely unearned moment, where the film attempts to somewhat humanise Michael for a second. As he corners Jamie for the final kill, she calls him uncle, and this gives him pause. And he even removes his mask. As she touches his face though, this sends him into a manic fury and he continues the chase. There's something there that's interesting, I'm sure, and it was the director's intention to humanise Michael in some way, hence Loomis uncharacteristically reasoning with him as well, but it just doesn't feel earned. There simply isn't enough in the film prior to give us this moment, so it doesn't work. And because it doesn't work, it only serves to undermine Michael's already dwindling threat levels that were first harmed by the familial and occult revelations of 2 even further. Either make him be a can't be reasoned with monster, or set up to humanise him. Don't do both, because then his uninterrupted monstrosity undermines our belief in his humanity, and his sudden humanity undermines his status as a monster to be feared. It's just all not very good. Whatever though. To close out, Loomis goes mad and uses Jamie as bait, again wildly clashing in tone with the guy we just saw reason with Michael prior. This film just does not know what to do with him. Is this man desperate or understanding? Pick a damn lane, movie. Anyway, he gets Michael with a tranquilizer gun. I honestly can't remember if the reason he's using a tranq and not a normal gun is explained, or whether this is another example of the movie's wild inconsistency with its approach to Loomis, but call me unprofessional, I genuinely cannot bring myself to care enough to check. He then beats Michael unconscious with a plank of wood before collapsing on him himself, and Michael is taken into custody, and then we get a total ass pull of an ending where a mysterious man in black breaks Michael out of prison, and we end on the image of Jamie weeping, knowing he's still out there. What a crock of bollocks. I know I don't like to rag on films, but this is just bad. Not even bad in an interesting way like Jason Goes to Hell or Freddy's Dead, just bad. Its one redeeming quality, Danielle Harris's fantastic acting, is even hampered by the decision to make her mute for half the movie and give her such terrible material to work with. Credit to the kid, she still manages to convey a lot of emotion without dialogue, which is demanding even for an adult, never mind a child, but it's a small saving grace in what is an otherwise irredeemable dull slog. I genuinely like this less than both Jason Goes to Hell and Freddy's Dead. I know it probably doesn't seem like it because I haven't went as insane covering this as I did those other two, but that's honestly because I find it extremely hard to care about this one. I nothing this film, and that's honestly worse than hating it. It is dire in its dullness, its only interesting point of discussion being in its wasted potential. Though it introduces several bad elements, the never before established or hinted at telepathic link, Loomis's awful and inconsistent characterization, a humanized but also not at all humanized Michael, it never does anything truly awful enough to be interesting. It is as risk averse as can be. Even in introducing its ill-advised more supernatural elements, it is never brave enough or experimental enough to commit to examining and expanding upon those ideas. It revolutionizes itself in only the most dull and predictable way, with a higher body count and more gore. It is the filmic equivalent of an exasperated and bored sigh. If you like this movie, and I know there are some out there that do, more power to you, but I cannot say I personally recommend it. And you know the worst part? It is not my least favourite film in the Thorn trilogy. You know, Halloween's original outing is literally my favourite slasher of all time. You only need to watch the first minute of my video on that one from a few days back to understand that I hold it in very, very high regard. It is a testament then to how low this franchise's dips are that even when including that incredible masterpiece from 1978, this is probably my least favourite slasher series, at least out of the ones I'm covering this month. While I don't think any of the other big slasher franchises, even with the incredible highs of Scream, the imaginative peaks of Nightmare on Elm Street, and the damn fun time of my personal love Jason Lives, ever quite reach the unmatchable greatness of that first instance of Michael Myers picking up a knife, none of them do what Halloween does and insert a whole trilogy slap bang in the middle of the franchise that at best I do not like and at worst I actively loathe. Scream is pretty consistent across the board. Nightmare has its big dips with 5 and 6, but they're not without some merit, and Friday the 13th might be a mixed bag the entire franchise, but it never hits the 3 in a row hat-trick of hatred streak that we have here. Halloween 6 is the final film in the Thorn trilogy, my personal series low point that is mentioned in previous videos, but I'll repeat again here for any newcomers, was the series' way of bouncing back from the commercial misfire of a Michael Myers-less Halloween 3. Firstly bringing the pale masked murderer back for a return to form, if not a bit paint by the numbers formulaic slasher that to its credit had what could have been a real game changing ending, before then bafflingly switching course and doubling down on the supernatural and occult aspects of the characters, quickly setting up plot points in the 5th entry that revolved around cults, cursed tattoo markings, mysterious men in black, and telepathic familial links, with absolutely no idea where any of this was going in the next entry, even when the film ended with an obviously sequel baiting cliffhanger. Which of course brings us now up to Halloween 6, the low point of the low point. Once again, I'm not going to repeat myself. I've gave you this speech before on the Jason Goes to Hell video about how I wanted to prioritise celebratory content on this channel and find the good and the bad, but I've got to say, in my sincerest opinion, that's simply not possible with Halloween 6. This film is an incomprehensible train wreck. I say, with absolutely no hyperbole, that I have seen narratively nonsensical student films that have failed to pass their classes that are more cohesive and better assembled than this movie. I want to stress that I mean that. I'm not exaggerating for crassness sake, I genuinely believe this. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to be facetious. On a technical basis, this is obviously a lot more professionally shot than those. It's probably better technically than anything I could ever put out. You know, it's got a budget, it's got professional lighting, professional camera setups, a huge crew to do lots of impressive Hollywood level things. There's complex tracking shots, there's elaborate locations, scenes with lots of extras. That's not the part I'm criticising here. Purely on plot and the execution of that plot through editing choices, the final product is a complete fucking mess. There's literally just no nice way to say it. It's contrived to the point of being borderline gibberish at times, and taken as a whole, it's just absolutely fucking dreadful. How the hell did this happen? Well, this, ladies, gentlemen, and NBs, is the perfect example of the phrase, making it up as you go along. As already noted in yesterday's vid, a lot of threads were put into Halloween 5, and to a lesser extent even a little of Halloween 4, with no clue where they were going. And when I say no clue, I mean these people had not one sodding clue what any of this was about. Daniel Farrens, who wrote this 6th film, before he started actually called up the writers of both Halloween 4 and 5 and asked what they had in mind when they put all these unanswered threads in. He thought maybe they had some sort of rough idea perhaps in their head where they expected this stuff to go, or some kind of starting point at least. Just any kind of baton he could take and run with, and they had absolutely nothing. According to Farrens, he was just left to pick up the pieces, so already not a good starting point. And Farrens was not the first to try his hand at making sense of all this. This film went through multiple, completely different drafts. Phil Rosenberg wrote the first ever called Halloween 6, 6, nice, The Origin. And it is, also hot garbage. To give you some quick highlights, Michael is a homeless man, which I suppose he already kind of is, being an escaped patient and all, but like, he's literally depicted as a homeless wanderer in this, and it has the incredibly implausible reveal that Michael has, would you believe it, another secret sister besides Laurie Strode. Returning character Tommy, a child who survived the first film's killing spree, is now an adult with a VR Ouija board that allows him to see into the past and find out that Michael Myers was cursed by the gods, and at one point, Michael murders someone with a rat. Apparently this script was actually thrown across the room by series producer Mustafa Akkad after he read it. And Scott Spiegel, Evil Dead 2's co-writer who was pegged to direct this version of the film, said in an interview with Fangoria that he was actually relieved when he lost the job, saying, "The script that we were going to shoot at the time was going to be hard to overcome. And my feeling was that I didn't need to be the one to make a crummy sequel to what had been a decent series of films." Tarantino was offered a shot at it at one point, but never got further than brainstorming an opening when Michael Myers and the Man in Black went on a road trip down Route 66, murdering everyone at each stop they made along the way, before ultimately he turned the job down. Carpenter was asked to return and suggested to set the film in a space station. Yeah, there was a brief moment where Michael X was a possible thing. Not to be confused with Malcolm X, very different movie. And although I can't find a source for it other than this random What Culture listicle, allegedly the suggestion was thrown around to reveal that series mainstay Dr. Loomis was Michael's dad, and in another draft that Michael's mother was being kept as a sex slave by the Man in Black. I really hope that's not true. You would perhaps think, after having heard a lot of what we could have got, that the curse of Michael Myers we actually ended up with might be a small mercy, but it's not. It is probably about as bad as any of that other nonsense could have been. And you might think this was the fault of a lazy effort by the writer, but it's really more complex than that. Farrens was actually a huge fan of the franchise, and had been trying to get involved in making Halloween 6 since 1990, 5 years before the film's eventual release, showing up to an early meeting with a massive custom-made booklet covering all the characters and relationships previously established and where he envisioned taking the franchise from there. But after some legal battles put the film on hold for a bit, he didn't get hired until 1994 and was presumably pretty damn pumped to finally land a gig he'd been clamming for years. However, he was hired in June and they'd already scheduled shooting dates for October before he'd even typed a word. Plus, he obviously had to play with the terrible cards he'd been dealt, namely tying up all those nonsensical loose ends previous writers had left him. While I don't personally believe there was ever a good film in development at any point, after all it was Farren's decision as early as his first draft to double down on the Cult of Thorn shtick and had a weird focus on Michael's sexually deviant behaviour, something he personally theorised the character always had. There was probably at least a better film than what we got before this already ill-advised script and mythology got the too many kooks treatment as the film was created. Though Farrens is the only credited writer, this film, according to him, went through 10 redrafts throughout production and crossed multiple hands who all had differing levels of input and revisions, in the end creating something that even Farrens, who literally wanted to explain Michael's mythology, admits went too far in its explanations. And this 10 redrafts through the production line is easy to believe when you consider this film is almost gibberish in its final form, literally feeling like a Frankenstein's monster of a million different writers' ideas, and that it has a distinctly different producer's cut with like 45 minutes of differing footage, a totally different colour grade and score, and a completely different ending, creating an experience that's a little better in some places, a little worse in others, but still, overall, just really rather bad. But that's a whole other story I'll touch on as this video develops. God, production on this thing sounds like an actual nightmare. Add to this a snowstorm that disrupted early filming and forced multiple location changes, the producer and the director fighting deadlines by rewriting the ending on set shot to shot like it was a fucking improv night, test screenings producing miserable results, and things getting so bad that Miramax had to step in and take over the film's production, ordering reshoots on top of already reworked scenes, including scenes which featured actor Donald Pleasance, who had at this point passed away, and you have the recipe for an absolute shit show. And I suppose at this point I should probably tell you what that shit show looks like. You'll notice I've got really far into this video now and I haven't even started on the plot, or plots if you include the producer's cut, and part of that is because the production is so messy there's a lot to talk about there, but another part of it is just because I don't have a fucking clue what happens in this thing. I've seen this movie twice now for this video, and I have no fucking idea what any of it is about. If you asked me to describe the plot, I'd struggle to articulate it to you. I am at a loss. I can tell you little bits. I can tell you there's a cult who kidnapped Jamie and Michael at the film's opening. I can tell you that the character of Jamie Lloyd, who I thought was the saving grace of the previous two movies, is played by a different woman and killed off really unceremoniously in like the first 10 to 20 minutes, or survives up until the very end if you're watching the producer's cut, but spends most of the runtime off screen in a coma until she's shot in the head. Both versions treat this character horrendously. I don't need to get into another rant about how much it bothers me when slasher sequels take away the narrative victories of their heroes from prior films. If you've been watching this show since day one, Lord knows you've had enough of that. But needless to say, I hate this, and that's not even the biggest bullshit surrounding this character. Firstly, her actress change is surrounded in controversy. According to Danielle Harris, who was 17 at the time and wanted the role so badly she paid to have herself legally emancipated so she could be free to make the decision to take it on, she was officially cast for the part. But then they turned around and offered her a scaled $1,000, which didn't even cover her emancipation fees. She asked for more, and in interviews she stressed she wasn't asking for like a crazy amount or anything, but allegedly the head of casting refused to negotiate her salary, stating that, "You're a scale character who dies in the first 20 minutes. So she dropped out and they brought in JC Brandy as a replacement. So that's bullshit. Nothing against the actress who replaced her, of course, it's just this really obviously sucks for Danielle and anyone who had grown to like her in the role. And secondly, besides dying, her only role in this film was to pop out a baby before disappearing. Whose baby, you ask? Well, that's another whole story and depends on which cut you watch. In the theatrical release, it's never really established who the dad is, and there's a random cutaway when they're in the cult compound of like fetuses suspended in walls and shit at some point, which I really didn't understand on first viewing, but now I think is meant as a way to explain the child's origin as being some kind of test tube baby experiment on the cult's part. And in the producer's cut, oh boy, the child is it's Michael and Jamie's incest baby, who it's heavily implied assaulted Jamie at the demand of the cult. Dear God, no thank you. Absolutely not. This feels so wrong. And I don't just mean in the general sense that an incest baby is a pretty gross, sensationalist little side add-on that this series did not need, but also in the sense that this feels narratively wrong. Like, my understanding of Michael and everything we've seen him to be implies, at least to me, that he's just not a sexual being at all. Like, I don't think he knows how. Yeah, he has a hyperfixation on mostly female victims, and obviously there's that strange relationship with his sister and his actions against her that all have a kind of uncomfortable undertone. But I always took Michael's violence in that sense to be some kind of method of acting out when not understanding what to do with any strange urges. If Michael's condition is psychosexual, as Farrington believes, which is still debatable somewhat, but let's just say we follow that reading, then it's specifically violence instead of sex. Not sexual violence, if that makes sense. I mean, he murders like everybody who shags. Sex is not something he truly understands. Surely, is that just me? Am I alone in this reading? I think I'm making sense. Am I making sense? Either way, incest baby's a fucking weird choice, and one of the few ways I think the theatrical cut might be better, even if its answer to the question seems to be random fetus wall. Now, what else happens in this film? Well, Paul Rudd is a major character in this, and he is terrible. Just absolutely dreadful in the role. Completely stilted line delivery, a totally confused performance, and just weirdly unexpressive. I don't think his bad performance is necessarily his fault. I mean, we've all seen Paul Rudd in things where he's effortlessly charismatic and fun to watch, but the weird reserved character he plays here is either completely out of his skill set, or really badly directed, or written, or some combination of all three. This is actually his first film, and I'm honestly shocked he got work after it. I mean, I'm glad he did. Dude's Paul Rudd, guy's great. But if I'd only seen him in this, I wouldn't be keen to cast him in anything else. He plays returning character Tommy Doyle, one of the children from the original Halloween who survived, now all grown up and obsessed with Michael Myers. He's the guy that uncovers the whole Thorn cult stuff. Apparently Michael was inflicted with the druidic curse of Thorn. This film's explanation for the tattoo on his wrist shared by the man in black that was introduced and not explained in the previous movie. It's kind of this film's central revelation. Basically, Michael isn't necessarily bad, I think, but he was cursed by this cult in a way that made him doomed to slaughter all next of kin, so that I guess some blood sacrifice quota was met. And that's why Jamie's baby is so important. I think this is also the explanation given for Michael's seemingly immortal state. That's something to do with the curse too. Although I honestly could be mistaken on any of this, I'm just sort of piecing it together as I do this video. I think, and I'll be honest, I had to skim Wikipedia to confirm a lot of this, the basic premise is that Jamie and Michael were kidnapped by the cult at the start of the movie. Jamie is impregnated for some reason and by different methods depending on which version you watch. I'm not sure why, as it seems Michael just had to kill what was left of his family for whatever ritual was planned here. Feel like he could have just killed Jamie and had one less target rather than the cult making her have a baby so he'd have another. That bit's still a little lost on me. Especially because in the film's final act they reveal that the baby was the result of the rather ridiculous partnership between the cult and Smith Grove Psychiatric Hospital, where Michael used to be kept and Loomis used to work. Apparently those two institutions teamed up to clone Michael's evil. What? I mean, even if we put aside the absolute absurdity of the sentence I have just delivered, doesn't that, not align with the rest of the film's absurdities? The baby's on a sacrificial altar at the film's opening. Was that just for shits and giggles? Is Michael not trying to kill the child? Isn't he supposed to be destined to do so because he's got to kill all familial links? And no, that's not an invitation to explain this to me. In the nicest possible way, I promise you, I do not care and it will not make the film better for me. Because the thing is, even if this does all somehow make sense, it's so overly contrived, ridiculous, badly assembled, and inconsistent. It would be just as awful even if I could wrap my head around all of it. Now I know with every movie, no matter how bad, there will always be some defenders. I know there's every possibility that someone in the comments on this vid who's an avid lover of the movie might pull the whole, oh you just don't get it, or oh if you just paid more attention card. And look, if you love the movie, more power to you. Enjoy the hell out of it. I'm happy that you like it. Truly, I am. But before you suggest me not really comprehending this film's events without consulting third-party materials is my fault, ask yourself why not just me, but also, from having now looked, many others all find this film convoluted, contrived, and messy, and can't bring themselves enough to care to try and comprehend its poorly edited plot. Even if you assume that all the overly expository mysticism stuff is good, actually, and all this contrived cult nonsense is fine and dandy, the rest of the film still falls completely on its arse at every hurdle. There is so much going on in this film, and absolutely none of it is compelling, scary, or even remotely interesting. Yeah, okay, I suppose I can generally follow the plot somewhat. I get that at its most basic simple premise, it's about Tommy Doyle finding out about Michael Myers' curse and everyone trying to save Jamie's baby from Michael and the cult after finding him where she hid him at a gas station before she died. I comprehend that. It's a bad story, poorly told, but I generally understand that's the gist. But there's a million other narrative threads, ridiculous contrivances, and baffling creative decisions I'm not even mentioning, totally disconnected from all this nonsense. Right, when Jamie escapes from the cult with her baby thanks to the help of a midwife, she runs to another location and calls into, of all places, a shock jockey radio station, speculating on conspiracy theories surrounding Michael Myers to say she's being chased by him, calling out something along the lines of, Dr. Loomis, if you're hearing this, he's coming. And Loomis happens to have this exact station on at this exact time because he seems like a dude really tuned into the goings on of radio shock jockeys and he hears her cry. I'm sorry, that's just dumb. It's contrived, it's nonsensical, and I simply do not buy it. And I'm not wanting to point out plot holes and contrivances and go, oh, this makes the movie bad. What I want you to understand, though, is it's not just this. It's that the whole film is like this. And that's just one example of ridiculous writing besides the whole evil cult baby stuff, and it happens in the first 5 minutes. That's not all, of course. There's a whole subplot where the town of Haddonfield are trying to ban Halloween that goes absolutely nowhere. The big reveal of who the man in black is? It's just Dr. Loomis's old co-worker from Smith's Grove. A character who has like 5 seconds of screen time in the first film, and who we've otherwise not met outside of his mysterious Man in Black persona until this movie, in which he plays an extremely minor and forgettable role until the point of his reveal. That's a narratively satisfying conclusion to your central mystery, isn't it? That doesn't fall flat at all. Want more? There's an entire family who mostly exist to die, but 2 of which play a huge role in the film, and all of them are apparently related to Laurie Strode and live across the road from Tommy. The main 2 important ones here are this lady Cara and her son Danny, who gets really intense and seems a bit stabby when Cara's abusive father gets physical with her. Would you believe that this goes nowhere and actually their plot ends up being that Danny and Cara are important to the cult as they're going to somehow be used as a means for the cult to clone another evil Michael baby? Well, you better believe it, because that's what happens. Had enough with overcomplications and just want an example of a scene that just falls flat? Okay, wanna guess how Michael is finally confronted in this film at the end? You know, that showdown all these movies build up to. Well, of course, we just had Paul Rudd beat him with a pipe while using this awful flashy montage transition effect to undermine any sense of physicality it might have had, and then Michael bleeds this brownish yellow. I mean, come on. What the fuck is any of this about? This is disastrous. Doesn't help as well that the theatrical cut is given that horrible stylistic choice of random transition cuts consisting of sudden flashes of frantic music video style horror visuals. Oh yeah, that's not just for the Paul Rudd fight scene, that's a stylistic choice present through the whole movie, as if the film isn't already hard enough to follow. The producer's cut at least doesn't have these, but it's just as confusing and messy. Its ending sees the baby put on a sacrificial altar and Michael about to kill him, as this will then pass the curse onto Cara's kid Danny, who will then kill Cara and I guess become the new Michael. This does explain, of course, that at some point in production the baby killing was the planned plot point, and that's why it feels like that's where the film's going up until the baby is a Michael clone reveal of the theatrical cut. But regardless, this is still just as contrived and wrapped up in layers of nonsensical mysticism that are so far removed from the simplicity of this character that once made him special. Anyway, the main cast, that is to say Tommy, Cara and Danny, escape with the kid when Michael is stopped from killing him after he finds out the child is his. And then Tommy uses rune magic to stop Michael pursuing them. Loomis helps them escape and goes back to kill Michael, but when he removes Michael's mask, he finds out it's his old colleague and cult leader, Dr. Wynn, who passes on to him the symbol of Thorn, and the film ends with Michael getting away and Loomis screaming at his newfound cult leadership status. There is no good version of this film. There is simply a terrible one, and a slightly less terrible one. Although the producer's cut makes a bit more sense, it foreshadows reveals a bit more, Wynn is a bigger character, other stuff gets explained a little better, and it's nowhere near as obnoxious in its editing, it's still just an overcomplicated mess of a movie, and although better overall, is even worse in some aspects, like the whole incest baby thing. Whichever version of the movie you watch, the film's messy, overcomplicated production is always seen clear as day in the end result through its messy, overcomplicated plot. There is nothing to like here, at least not that I can personally find. The film doesn't even work as a turn your brain off slasher movie. It's never dumb enough to be fun, just mildly confusing, and on the rare occasions it attempts to be something resembling a Halloween film, it's a really bloody dull one. Every kill is neither shocking, nor tense, nor scary. At best, the biggest physical reaction any of these things will elicit from you is an uninterested shrug. Even Donald Pleasance, who is fantastic, cannot elevate this thing. I'm really sorry to say I want to find something positive about it, but honestly, it's just garbage. It is a textbook example of how much the mistakes of pre-production and production can leak into the end product. A physical representation of the saying, too many cooks spoils the broth. It is astoundingly awful. It fails on every level. It's not a good Halloween film, it's not a good slasher, it's not a good occult movie. It's simply not a good film, period. It's dreadful. I like this film less than Freddy's Dead. I like this film less than Jason Goes to Hell. For all of their similar flaws with overcomplicated mythology and contrived nonsense, they were at least better assembled and never quite reached the levels of confusing and messy as this thing does. This is, in my opinion, the single worst movie I am going to cover this month. The only way I can recommend it is as an exercise in deconstruction. Don't watch it for fun in any capacity, because you simply won't find it. Watch it solely to take it apart, look at what went wrong, and try and understand why. Yes, there was a bad production, but there's so many elements that make this film not work, that it's not as simple as that. It is a combination of bad ideas, bad executions, and honestly, to be fair to them, just dramatic misfortunes that very unfortunately turned out the worst possible result that all those aspects could bring to the table. And in that sense at least, it's kind of fascinating, but boy am I glad I'm done talking about it. So after yesterday finally saw us finish the god-awful Thorn trilogy of Halloween films, today we jump over to a different Halloween timeline with Halloween H20. H2O? I think it's H20 because it's released on the 20th anniversary, but also whenever you see that combination of letters and number, you read it as H2O, right? Because besides this film, when else do you ever see that? Whatever, today we'll be looking at Halloween H2O/H20. God, this film's title is stupid. So Halloween Chemical Formula of Water is the 7th film in the Halloween series, though you wouldn't necessarily think that from its plot. That's because this film sees Jamie Lee Curtis returning to her iconic role of Laurie Strode for the first time since 1981's Halloween 2. But wait, I hear you cry. Didn't Laurie Strode die in an off-screen car crash that took place between Halloween 2 and Halloween 4? That's absolutely correct. However, this film is in a different continuity and now seems like the perfect time to dive into the single most confusing chronology in all of slasher history. I very briefly touched on this earlier, but up to this point, detour of Halloween 3 aside, the series is pretty straightforward in how it should be watched. You go 1, 2, 3's an oddity, then 4, 5, 6. Fairly easy to follow along with. 3 gets weird, but otherwise it's in order. However, as Halloween Just Add Water introduced an alternative continuity, it marked the first point at which this series got hilariously messy. I'll explain properly how this all works for those interested, but just to put into perspective where we're at right now in 2021, there are currently 3 films in this series just called Halloween. Halloween 1978, Halloween 2007, and Halloween 2018. 2 of those movies are first films in their series continuity, but one of the films is a sequel to the first film. Yes, Halloween is a sequel to Halloween. There's also a different sequel, Halloween 2. Not, of course, to be confused with the other film, also called Halloween 2. The newest film in the series is technically the 3rd film in the original film's continuity, but it is not called Halloween 3, and instead Halloween Kills. Halloween 3 is, of course, completely its own thing. It is not a sequel to Halloween 2, nor is it a sequel to Halloween 2. Halloween 4 is the next film to take place after Halloween 2, but also Halloween H20, the 7th film released in this series, is also a sequel to Halloween 2. That's the original Halloween 2, of course, and not the second Halloween 2. That film's obviously a sequel to Halloween, not Halloween. If you're unfamiliar with this series, you might be thinking, Dan, what the fuck are you saying? But look, I'll explain it really easy. Think of Halloween as a choose-your-own-adventure novel. You watch the first Halloween film, and a little dialogue box pops up and says, "Congratulations, you conquered Halloween. Now where to next, traveller?" If you pick, "I want to find out that Laurie is Michael's sister," you get Halloween 2. If you pick, "That sister option sounds stupid. Can I skip 40 years ahead and have that never happen?" you get Halloween 2018. If you pick, "I'm a fucking weirdo and want masks to eat children's faces," you get Halloween 3. Yeah, it looks super messy when you see one of these fan-made graphs like this, but honestly, it sounds and looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. The reboot Rob Zombie directed Halloween and Halloween 2 are their own thing, but that's standard in most reboots. Halloween 3 is a one and done outlier, and everything else just connects back to Halloween 1 in some way. And the films, to their credit, always make sure you know how. Is Laurie dead when the film starts? Okay, well you're in the Thorn trilogy. And you know you are because it's the only timeline where Laurie is dead and her daughter is the protagonist. Is Laurie alive and related to Michael? Then you're either in Halloween 2 or one of the films that are a sequel to that film. She's alive but her and Michael aren't related, then you're in the current and my personal favourite timeline. Is it a little confusing that Halloween has 2 direct sequels, one of which also has 2 direct sequels? Yeah, but That's just how it is. I had to get to this shit eventually, might as well do it at the first timeline split. Speaking of, all of that is just to say that Halloween Hydration here is a direct sequel to Halloween 2 and completely ignores the films 3, 4, 5 and 6. So, question is, why? Why did we start again? And if you watched my video yesterday, the answer is probably pretty obvious. The Thorn trilogy had started off commercially promising with Halloween 4, but by the time Halloween 6 came out with its critically panned, incomprehensible narrative that didn't even go down well with a lot of the die-hard fans and proved to be another commercial flop, that particular narrative had wrote itself into an unsalvageable corner that nobody in their right mind wanted to see more of. Not even the original potential writer for Halloween 7, Daniel Farrens. You see, Mr. Farrens, during pre-production of the 6th movie, had a treatment for the 7th called Michael Myers' Lord of the Dead, which was supposed to pick up straight where 6 left off and have that film's protagonist Tommy Doyle find out the whole town was in on this weird cult conspiracy unearthed in that movie. Why did this not happen? Because he saw the end result of what 6 became upon release and thought, oh Christ no, stating in an interview that he honestly could not bear to watch another one of his scripts turned into a debacle, especially another Halloween. Oof. There was a briefly considered direct-to-video continuation with Myers and a copycat killer at an all-women's boarding school. That would probably have been about as good as it sounded, which is to say, not good. Thankfully though, that was scrapped, and somewhere along the lines, an uncredited Kevin Williamson of Scream fame wrote what would be the foundations of the film, bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode, but initially keeping it in the Thorn trilogy continuity with the suggestion that she had faked her death. But after some further rewrites, all that shit was just retconned entirely, and it was decided those films just didn't count. From this point on, it was Halloween 1, Halloween 2, this movie, and nothing else mattered, in a wild canon revision that would give comic book continuities pause. Writers Robert Zappia and Matt Greenberg put together a final screenplay based on Kevin Williamson's initial premise, albeit tweaked to take place in this new timeline, and ignore the artifacts and plot beats it had left in it from films 4, 5 and 6. And we're all good, right? 20th anniversary is coming up, Jamie Lee Curtis is super up for the story idea they've got, and is coming back to play the lead, bringing a greater star power than the series has ever had before now that she's mega famous off the backs of big hits like Fish Called Wanda, Trading Places, and a Golden Globe winning performance in James Cameron's True Lies. Should all be smooth sailing, right? Well, there's one big and strange hiccup. Jamie Lee Curtis has an arc for Laurie in her head, one about trauma and overcoming it. Themes that are in fact present in the film, but Curtis wants to end that arc, ending the series through killing Michael. Just one problem. You cannot kill Michael Myers. And I don't mean like, oh, the character's super strong and hard to beat. No, I mean you literally cannot kill Michael Myers. It's illegal. Series overseer Mustafa Akkad had a clause written into contracts that writers could not kill Michael Myers off. That's real, that's a thing. Does this make Michael Myers the most powerful slasher villain? I think it does. If there was ever a versus fight to the death between him and any other character, legally, he can't lose. Now I, for one, am delighted to find out about this little bit of trivia. Curtis, however, was less thrilled. When she found this out and the original ending left Michael Myers burning in a fire but with an ambiguous fate as to whether he survived it or not, she threatened to walk from the project on the spot. That is, until Kevin Williamson came back for a little bit of extra script doctoring and created a way for Jamie Lee Curtis to have her ending and audiences get a chance to see the film and get a big sense of finality and closure that didn't at all hint toward a sequel, something Curtis insisted upon, but that also had a cheeky little setup going on in the background that made sure they could start a sequel film that followed the events of this one and still have Michael Myers. And it's oh boy, it's a doozy. But we'll get to that. And you might have to wait for the next video for that one. With that ironed out though, Curtis was happy to stay on. They attached a director. Initially they offered series creator John Carpenter, but angry that he hadn't received revenue he felt he was owed for the original Halloween, he asked for a $10 million starting fee and a 3-picture deal, to which Akkad went, "Ha! Get fucked, mate!" And Steve Miner, who directed Friday the 13th Parts 2 and 3, was brought on instead, presumably for a much cheaper fee. And how was the film? It's alright. It's pretty decent. Halloween Squirtle Edition is set naturally in October 1998. 20 years after the first film, and it begins with a young Joseph Gordon-Levitt, yay, who dies. Aww. When Michael returns to his neighbourhood to rob the nurse next door, and he, along with his friend and the nurse herself, end up in his path. The reason for his burglary is it turns out the nurse was someone who had taken care of Michael's old doctor, one Dr. Loomis, until he passed away. Amongst her possessions is the good doctor's old files, including one on a certain missing Laurie Strode, which Michael has something of an interest in. Cut to titles and we find out in a montage of headlines that Laurie is believed to have died in a car accident. Only, no she hasn't. So frightened of Michael Myers returning to finish what he started, she's tried to cover all tracks that lead to her by faking her death and changing her identity, and is now headmistress of private school Hillcrest Academy, going by Kerry Tate. Also at Hillcrest Academy are the rest of our main cast, including Laurie's love interest, the school's guidance counsellor Will, Laurie's son John, his girlfriend Molly, and their friends, a couple called Charlie and Sarah, and of course, professional rapper LL Cool J, who plays security guard and aspiring erotic novelist Ronnie.
He turned just in time to see her enter the room. With her long, slender legs, they climbed high up her skirt, leading to two tumultuous, round, melon breasts.
You know what? Rad. I'm into this. More films should have LL Cool J read porn to the audience. Stick him in Finding Nemo. Anyway, Laurie leads a pretty hunky-dory life. Only, no she doesn't, because despite being the head of a really swanky posh school, she's suffering PTSD that surfaces especially around Halloween time. And this causes friction in her day-to-day life and relationships, especially with her son, who she becomes extremely overprotective with. So overprotective in fact, she won't let him go on a school trip, leading him and his friends to find alternative entertainment, planning a party in the basement. But party crashers here. Michael tracks Laurie down and gets to killing, making quick work first of Charlie and Sarah, and credit to this film, it's got a decent bit of tension going for it. I mean, it's nothing like the nail-biting atmosphere of the original, but all the kills and stuff leading up to them, they're all pretty appropriately drawn out, gruesome when they need to be, but primarily more focused on the chase, which is where all your best scares come anyway. And the characters are decently likeable and easy to root for, so it's easy to become invested when Michael is on the hunt. Solid stuff, and a good few memorable sequences. Especially how they use the dumbwaiter. They get a lot of mileage out of this thing. One thing I must say I don't like though is this CGI mask. That is all kinds of not good. It's not CG the whole way through the film, thank God, seemingly just for this shot. Apparently it was a necessity due to some problematic reshoots. Not sure how exactly that led to the need for a CG mask, but sure, maybe this genuinely was the best possible option. However, that end result is awful. Really takes you out of the moment if you notice it. As Michael attempts to pick off the rest of the teens, John and his girlfriend Molly are able to flee and reunite with his mother, and we get this incredible moment between Laurie and Michael when she comes face to face with him through a window for the first time in 20 years. It's honestly still great. Even with the 2018 movie being a better Laurie character piece overall, this shot through the window on the door is spine-tingling. It has so much weight and meaning for these characters. Honestly, goosebumps every time. One of the best bits of the whole film. In fact, all the stuff with Michael and Laurie is great. I can take or leave her kid, her love interest, the security guard, and the other teens, like, they're fine, they're inoffensive, they pad out the runtime, but Laurie and Michael are the main attraction here. And as we fall into the third act, the film really delivers on the culmination of the violent tension that's been building between them. So Laurie's partner accidentally shoots LL Cool J thinking he's Michael, only for Michael to surface and then kill him. Laurie gets the kids out to safety, delivering a line that's a throwback to the original film, as well as a screen reference when she tells them, "Drive down the street to the Beckers," which is Drew Barrymore's character's family name in Scream, and is also a very similar line to when Jamie Lee Curtis says to the kids in Halloween 1978, "Go down the street to the Mackenzies." Also, while we're on the subject of Scream references, there's a scene earlier in the movie where two of the students are watching Scream 2. And that's all hunky-dory, but that means Scream 1 exists in this fictional universe, and Scream 1 has a scene where the character Randy watches the first Halloween movie. So that confuses my brain. Obviously just an oversight on the filmmaker's part, but it's fun to think of the weird paradox this presents. Anyway, with the kids out of the way, Laurie is free to confront Michael, and what a confrontation it is. These two fight hard. Lots of creative carnage on display spread across a fight that takes them to multiple different settings within the building, and it is great to see just how much Laurie goes at Michael, which we'd not really seen before from her character. She's pretty passive in both Halloween 1 and 2. Not totally, but like in 1, she's mostly terrified and just survives long enough for Loomis to save the day, and in 2, she's stuck in a hospital bed for most of the runtime. And although she plays a pretty active role at the end in places, it's absolutely nothing like this. This Laurie is giving it the beans. I love this part where she just stabs him repeatedly in a desperate fury and sends him over the banister. It's rad as hell and feels like a really great evolution of her character. Unfortunately, just as she's about to land her killing blow on a downed Michael, an apparently still alive LL Cool J stops her for some reason. He's all like, "Oh, he's dead, he's dead." Okay, great. Well, if that's the case, it's not gonna matter if she just gives him another little knifey poke, just to be sure. Is it? Well, whatever. This stops Laurie for the time being, but when she sees Michael being carted out by a paramedic, she is taking no fucking chances. And in a totally kick-ass ending, she grabs a gun, hijacks the ambulance, and drives Michael away. As he begins to stir in his body bag, a fight ensues, he's launched through the window, she runs him off the side of the cliff, and while he's trapped under the crushing weight of the ambulance, she takes an axe and de-fucking-capitates him. Incredible ending. Really cathartic, really great final stop on the Laurie Michael saga. Would have been a great ending to the franchise, but this continuity doesn't end there. And maybe this ending isn't so good after all, though that'll have to be explained in tomorrow's video. Until then though, that's Halloween H2O. And it's decent. It's a solid Halloween movie. It doesn't quite consistently hit a high mark like a lot of the stuff throughout this film is very average. All the college stuff and LL Cool J's weird romance novelist arc, it's whatever. It pads out the movie. It's pretty middling. Nothing to get excited about, but nothing to be upset about either. But it is carried by some real high points. Laurie is fucking excellent in this. The way she struggles with the weight of trauma on her, the way it causes friction in all her relationships, there's hints of PTSD and alcoholism there and then, and obviously that one-on-one first encounter with Michael and the final showdown it builds to all knock it out the park. It's really good stuff, it's just that most of the movie isn't that. Honestly, the best compliment I can give for Halloween Aqua here is that it feels like a dry run for the, in my opinion, exceptionally good and much better execution of these ideas in Halloween 2018. And that sounds like I'm damning it with faint praise, you know, calling it almost the budget version of a later film, but I genuinely mean that in a complimentary manner. It's bringing some really great ideas to the table here. That yeah, a future film would come along and handle way better in my opinion, but like, this was the first one to try it, and for the most part, it pulls off these new ideas well. This is a film primarily about trauma, specifically Laurie's, how she has to live with that trauma, how she copes day to day with the trauma, and how eventually, through confrontation with the very thing that gave her these issues, she's finally able to overcome it. And that stuff is all pretty good. If Halloween 2018 didn't exist and I hadn't seen that one first, I'd probably be singing this film's praises a lot. This is a refreshing take on this story, and I can totally see why it's a fan favourite. Especially for those that saw this before the 2018 film came along and massively refined all of its core concepts. And you know what? Even when you consider that the 2018 film exists and does what this film sets out to do better, it's still got a fair share of fun and unique moments. That porthole window shot, I know I keep going on about it, but it still slaps, even after you've seen Halloween 2018. It still lands just as effective. And the entire third act with the fighting and the furious stabbing and the crazy ass ambulance hijacking sequence to that final punch as she ends the killer once and for all, it's great. Love it. Hell, it killed Michael. Like, plainly killed him. No other film in the series has done that so unambiguously. Even the 2018 film couldn't get this ending because they couldn't kill the character off like this. Only, wait a minute. Neither could Halloween H20. I know we just saw that happen. I know that's the incredible ending this film deserves. But wasn't there like a clause that said the writers couldn't kill Michael? Because it looks pretty definitively like they did, doesn't it? How does this align with that contract clause? Well, to answer that question, we need to go to the next film. Halloween Resurrection isn't so much a divisive film as it is just a totally hated one. It marks the final film in the Halloween series before we enter the realm of reboots and further retcons, and boy do people not like it. Often considered the worst in the series by a lot of fans, and let me remind you, this is a series that has the borderline unwatchable Halloween 6. Resurrection acted as the immediate sequel to Halloween H20, or Halloween H2O? I'm still not really sure how they want me to say that awful title. Now if you've seen that previous movie, or you've watched yesterday's video, you might be thinking, wait, is Michael Myers not in this one then? How can they make a direct sequel to that film? And the answer they give, my friends, is I personally believe fucking hilarious. Okay, so, bit of a story behind this one. To talk about the development of this film, we have to go back to the end of the last one, because this film's opening was created on that film's set. As I mentioned in my last video, Jamie Lee Curtis only agreed to stay on for the previous movie in the lead role as Laurie Strode under one condition. There had to be no possible sign of a sequel. No teaser, no ambiguity, a closed character arc where she overcomes her trauma, defeats Michael, and that's it. But series producer Mustafa Akkad proved to create a thorn in this plan, as he had a clause written into writers' contracts that stated that legally they cannot kill Michael. Gotta leave him alive for that sequel money, baby. So we're at an impasse. Your star threatens to walk if her character can't have an arc where she defeats her biggest demon, but there's a legally binding contract that makes said demon unkillable by law. So they got Kevin Williamson of Scream fame back in after he created the foundations of the movie to do some script doctoring, and he came up with an ending where everyone was happy. Laurie gets her big moment, stares down her monster, decapitates him with an axe, and walks off into the sunset, never needing to look over her shoulder for the boogeyman again. But hold up, how did they decapitate Michael? Surely that constitutes killing him, right? Well friends, I can barely hold in my delight when I say this. That wasn't Michael. In an intelligence-insulting move planned from very early in Halloween H2O's production, as in literally before filming had started, Resurrection opens with a hideous exposition dump that reveals, get this, Michael Myers was not the man in the mask at the end that Laurie killed. Off screen, he had injured a paramedic who approached his body before the final moments of the film, crushing his throat so he couldn't tell anyone he wasn't Michael. He then swapped clothes with this paramedic and escaped, while Laurie kidnapped this complete fucking random dude and put him through hell before decapitating him. And I'm sorry, what the fuck? The absolute bullshittery they pulled here, I can't help but respect it. Just think about this for a second. They gave Laurie this empowering close to her arc of overcoming trauma, having her fight and claw her way to a satisfying victory, giving her a big action sequence and a slow, emotionally cathartic ending confronting her violent, murderous brother, and finally ending him. Played it off with complete sincerity the whole time, with all the dramatic lighting, acting and music that would accompany such a pivotal sequence, and they knew the whole time this dude wasn't Michael? The audacity, the disrespect, I'm sorry, this is fucking hilarious. Can you imagine if any other major series pulled this? Like, imagine for a second that Empire Strikes Back had the I am your father reveal from Darth Vader to Luke. It played out the exact same way with all the emotional conflict such a revelation would have, and then years later Return of the Jedi releases and started with Palpatine turning to Vader and being like, wait, so you're really that kid's dad? And Vader just went, what? No. Fuck no. I just thought it would be a funny thing to say. That's what Resurrection does here. And this isn't some writing bullshit in after the fact so they could make a sequel. They planned for this. They filmed the first shot of this film of Michael in a paramedic suit the immediate following day after wrapping on H20's principal photography. I can't help but respect this. It's the work of an evil genius. I absolutely cackled at this nonsense, and it gets worse the more you think about it. They didn't foreshadow this at all. I mean, okay, Mr. Not Michael paws at his mask a bit at the end of the film when he's crushed by the van there, but nah, Come on! Besides that, they absolutely double and then triple down on the pretense that this paramedic is Michael Myers. The dude attacks Laurie. He flies through a windshield. He does the Michael sit-up, and he's crushed by the weight of a van and is still alive before his decapitation. I'm sorry, is this guy Superman? Because if he isn't Michael, that's the only other explanation I can think of as to why he survives all this shit. Also, fucking Laurie, the last thing she's overcame her biggest fear in a moment of catharsis and pathos, but no, she's just battered the shit out of some poor random sod and then took his head off with an axe. This is horrendous. I love it. I can kind of see why this is thought of as the worst film in the series. The absolute horseshit they pull here is astounding. I'll bag on Halloween 6 for being an incomprehensible mess till the cows come home, but even I've got to admit it never pulls this level of disrespect with its characters. I mean, yeah, they probably shouldn't have killed the main character of the previous films unceremoniously in the first 20 minutes, but even with that, it still has a bit more respect for its characters and audience. But you know, that's just the opening. That nonsense sort of needed to be done to explain Michael coming back, but now that's out the way, we can do a proper movie now. Jamie Lee Curtis is back again as the original final girl Laurie Strode, and you know, after that last film, she's battle hardened now, she's not afraid anymore. I'm sure we'll get this really cool arc where she uses all she's learned and takes all that progress she's made and takes the fight to Michael. Not as a reluctant, frightened woman, but as a brave and courageous, nope, never mind, she dead. How long did that take? 15 minutes. 15 minutes. She spent her entire role of the film coming off her narrative victory of overcoming trauma and defeating her monster as a murderer confined to a mental institution for 3 years, who did in fact not defeat her monster, is stabbed and dies. And then the monster just kind of wanders away from the main conflict that has in some way been driving 6 of the previous 7 films, and just finds something else to occupy his time with. Now look, I know that sounds awful. I know that sounds like a spit in the face of your own character's narrative. I know it's really bold to alienate your core audience within the movie's opening sequence, but in the film's defense though, they had to kill Laurie this early. I mean, if you spend too much time giving your series' main protagonist a fitting narrative send-off, then you won't have time for professional rapper Busta Rhymes to do kung fu on Michael Myers.
So you want to be on Dangertainment? Let's see what you got.
This is spectacular. Is this film a shitpost? I mean, Busta Rhymes is kung fu fighting iconic mass murderer Michael Myers. That's something straight out of early 2000s YouTube sketch comedy. Is this a Halloween film or an episode of MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch? Okay, let's fly through the plot real quick so you can see how ridiculous it all is. So as already mentioned, Laurie killed a dude that wasn't Michael and is in an institution. Michael resurfaces to come kill her, and to the film's credit, she is a lot more ready for him this time round, which does somewhat acknowledge her character growth. Of course, she is immediately then killed, and we jump forward to a year later to meet an entirely different set of characters. Our protagonist this time round is this girl Sarah, a shy and introverted college student whose most intimate friendship is with a young lad she talks to in a chat room who goes by the username Deckard. Sarah, along with a cast of completely insufferable and very of the times early 2000s slasher teens, has been selected from an audition to take part in an internet reality show run by Busta Rhymes. Yes, I know his character name is Freddy, and no, I will not be referring to him as anything but Busta Rhymes. The show is called Dangertainment, and the students are lured in with the promise of a cash prize, and all they have to do is wear cameras that live stream their every move, although admittedly in horrendous grainy potato quality footage that absolutely no one would enjoy watching, while they stay the night at the abandoned childhood home of notorious serial killer Michael Myers. Unbeknownst to the teens, this reality show is a little less real than they imagined, with lots of elements placed in the house to give the performers something shocking to discover and the audience something to enjoy. An obvious on-the-nose commentary, of course, on the unreality of reality television, but one that cannot be taken seriously because 1. This is the most unnuanced examination of an audience's relationship with reality television that literally children were capable of making during the big reality boom of the 2000s. 2, it's completely self-contradictory in the messages it wants you to take away, arguing reality TV is trashy, exploitative titillation in one breath, and then finding ways to shoehorn in topless sex scenes within its own narrative in another. And 3, Busta Rhymes. While this is all going on and the film crew goes so far as to have a fake Michael skulk through the set to scare the contestants, the very real Michael Myers has returned home and started killing people. There's a sea of confusion where the real and the fake clash as Michael picks off the teens and crew one by one until only Sarah and Busta Rhymes are left. But luckily for her, Sarah has a secret weapon. Her online bestie Deckard is watching the stream and is able to use his vantage point of being able to see all the cameras to message her and warn her where Michael is, and she is able to escape. But not before Busta Rhymes has a kung fu showdown with Michael and is inexplicably the person to defeat him and save the day. Busta Rhymes is our hero in the end. A hero who calls Michael a motherfucker a lot.
Trick or treat, motherfucker. Fucker. Burn, motherfucker.
And that's pretty much it. The film ends with the news media swarming the scene and interviewing our heroes, which causes Busta Rhymes to go on a hilariously on-the-nose tirade, criticising the media for their sensationalism. Really, movie? You gonna pull that card? You gonna have this character? This one? The reality TV director who exploited these kids, essentially showing their tits on the internet and then getting them killed to be the sympathetic hero and voice of reason who says enough is enough? Okay, if that's what you want to do. And then after all that, we get a final tease of a presumed dead Michael stirring and revealing his "Don't Kill Me" contract hasn't been breached, setting us up for a sequel that never happened. This film is batshit. It tries to force Michael Myers, a character they only just managed to reinvigorate with a sense of purpose and presence after his image had been dragged through the mud for years, into a weird teen pop culture inspired narrative that sees him getting wrapped into the events of an online reality show. It screams of a committee of old dudes doing market research into what's cool. What are kids into these days? Well, they like the internet, so let's put a bit of that in there. And then let's give the soundtrack some of that rap and hip-hop those youngsters love so much. Kids like Jackie Chan too, right? Rush Hour 1 and 2 were just really popular. Let's have some kung fu in there. Get one of those rappers making Bruce Lee noises. That'll get him. You can tell this was assembled in a post-Scream world, as it feels like a film made by people who saw that Scream was popular for how it sort of freshly handled realistic teen stories and characters and felt topical and fresh while doing it, and then took all the wrong lessons from that film's success. This is a factory-made, AI-constructed attempt at the kind of fun teen Scream tone that throws in these completely misguided conceptions of whatever zeitgeisty thing was popular at the time. Just pause yourself for a moment, take a step back, remove yourself from the early Laurie death, the rap soundtrack, the Busta Rhymes kung fu, and what do we have as our central premise? The main thing that's supposed to hold our movie up and act as its foundations. Michael Myers on a reality TV show. This is so dumb, it's insane. Myers, even after you take into account all of his ill-advised films, is not that malleable a character. He's not Jason. He's not someone that was set up on such silly foundations and fluctuating quality that you can insert him into any ridiculous fanfic scenario your heart desires. You couldn't do Michael Myers versus a telekinetic teenager, or Michael Myers turns into a zombie, or Michael Myers goes to space. This is a character who, even with some misguided attempts to make him more supernatural, still exists in every timeline he's been in as the grounded killer who once stalked the quiet streets of Haddonfield that Halloween night in 1978. You can make a film that taps into and comments on the 2000s hot pot of newly brewing internet culture, and you can do it with an established character. A comic book character like Static would totally adapt to that kind of story. A big pop culture legacy character like the Doctor from Doctor Who could maybe do something with this. In the horror world, I could see Ghostface or Jigsaw doing that, but not Michael Myers. You can't just make a cheesy teen horror film about a goofy as hell internet reality show led by Busta Rhymes and organically shoehorn in Michael Myers. That's insane. That is an insane thing to do. But these mad lads did it, and I fucking love that. Now look, this film is bad. It's real bad. It completely misses the mark with its commentary on media and new media, seemingly having no clue what it wants to say about the subject. It treats its established characters with a complete lack of respect, murdering the final girl in the first 15 minutes and having Michael be defeated by jobbing him out to Busta Rhymes' goofy ass kung fu, and the whole thing is corny, ill-conceived, pretty poorly acted, with unlikable and forgettable characters, and just overall is dumb as hell. But I come from the pretty unique position of recently going into this movie mostly blind and being able to know that Halloween 2018 already exists and gives Laurie the proper narrative treatment she deserves. So I can treat this film just like the hilarious little oddity it now is. Had I seen it at the time of release, I'd have no doubt hated it, if not for anything else than its treatment of Laurie alone. It is sinful how much they undermine her character and arc. This is one of those rare films where its decisions are so bad, it somehow actively makes the preceding material that it follows worse. Halloween H20 is a worse film because of this movie's existence. Because as much as you can take it as standalone, and you absolutely should, it's a different film, different crew, different directors, different writers, and an overall different goal in mind, you cannot escape this weird metatextual knowledge that scratches that little irritating part of your brain and goes, that's not Michael in that mask, whenever you watch that film's conclusion. And knowing that just takes away from any catharsis that sequence could have. I might have considered this worse than Halloween 6 had I been one of the people who had to sit with it as the concluding chapter to those characters for a whole 16 years. But I didn't have to do that. I saw Halloween 2018, loved it, and that was my Laurie and my Michael. That was my continuation of those characters. And only after I already had that bookmarked in the happy places of my heart did I then watch Resurrection for the first time this year and get to just enjoy the silly nonsense ride of it all. It's a joyously bad movie, infinitely more watchable for me than a bunch of the sequels I consider to be far better films. Like, it's probably not too controversial to say I like this more than 5 or 6. It might raise a couple of eyebrows, but I imagine there's more than a few people out there who feel the same. But honestly, I prefer it to 4 too. And I know that's probably going to make me a Halloween pariah, but I can't help it. It's just so shit, it becomes more entertaining than 4's far superior, but also deeply serious efforts. Yeah, 4 might be a more sincere and genuine effort. It might be more respectful to the characters, be better written, better acted, and just generally a better film in every conceivable way. But I can't watch Busta Rhymes do Kung Fu in 4, can I? So, 1-0 Resurrection. I highly, highly recommend this film, and for the complete opposite reasons as to why I recommend the first film. I'm maybe being overly kind to it, not just because I didn't have to deal with it being the ending for 16 years, but also because I watched or rewatched all of the Halloween films back to back over a single weekend for these videos, and after sitting through several hours of seriousness, several of which were from the dreaded Thorn trilogy, this completely unexpected misfire caught me totally off guard, and added a great deal of levity that helped bring some new energy and life into the proceedings. Make no mistake, I will reiterate, it is bad with a capital B, but it's the good kind of bad if you ask me. I'm finding that with some of the movies in this marathon, I feel like I have to justify their inclusion in a Wholesome Halloween list. Like, no, please come back. I swear this movie about cannibal babies is wholesome and lovely. I swear it. And that's because the goal of this marathon is to make people challenge their preconceptions of horror, should they have any. And I feel like this movie, more than arguably any other movie on the list, is the one that I need to justify the most. Because on paper, it's a Halloween movie. It's part of a franchise that is as stereotypically horror as horror gets. A big scary dude in a mask kills a bunch of teenagers. I mean, how many films can this describe? Don't get me wrong, Halloween, and I'm talking the original here, not the 2018 sequel/reboot we're covering in this video, is bloody brilliant. It's fantastic, like legitimately an all-time classic in any genre. I'm not trying to belittle it when I describe it plainly like this and point out how many different franchises and its own sequels and reboots fit the exact same base description. But what I am saying is that if you ask somebody who doesn't really watch horror but that has formed an idea of what it is through pop cultural osmosis to describe what a horror movie might perhaps look like, if they didn't put forward something of the ilk of the recently popularized torture porn genre of something like Saw or Hostel, they would probably describe something very close to Halloween. The concept of the original Halloween, and to some extent the franchise as a whole, is so simple and entrenched in our understanding of what the horror genre, or to be more specific, the subgenre of slashers, is. And that's because Halloween kind of set the mold for everything that followed. While not the first slasher by any means, it did kind of become the blueprint that countless films after it would homage, imitate, or simply rip off. And so by the time you get to the 2000s, we've already had decades of iconic and not so iconic murderous men becoming so entrenched in the cultural zeitgeist that they're now theme park characters. And there's films like Scary Movie taking the piss out of their biggest scenes, and there's literally even a parody boy band called the Slash Street Boys where these characters sing about their murders. So it gets to a point where you don't even need to have given so much as a sideways glance towards the horror section in a blockbuster one time 20 years ago to have some concept of what these films are about. I could ask my mum, for example, who hates horror films and would refuse to watch them, what the Halloween movies are about. And she'd probably say something like, oh, that's that horrible film where he just goes around killing people. And to be honest, she's not wrong. And that's why I really want to include this particular movie, because 2018's Halloween is that film. On a surface level, my mum's description would be correct. It is everything I have said that horror doesn't necessarily have to be. It is kinda mean. It's intensely violent. It's problematic, as unfortunately a lot of horror is, in the way that it depicts people with mental illness as dangerous, despite statistically them being more likely to be the victims of violence, not the perpetrators. People, including children, die in it, who do nothing to deserve their fate, and often in graphic, brutal, painful ways, and are never mentioned again, thrown to the side as nothing more than voyeuristic cannon fodder. The film arguably even delights in this, lingering on the violence, going into meticulously grisly detail like showing Michael Myers drop the bloody teeth of a man he just murdered onto a dirty bathroom floor. And yet, this is kind of a comfort movie for me. And I realise that, given the description I have just delivered, this may make me seem like a bit of a psychopath. But I swear to you that this film, at its core, is about overcoming trauma and the powers of maternal love. Yep. This movie, the one with all the stabbing, it's lovely. I'm not even joking, it is a really quite lovely film. Set 40 years after the events of the original Halloween and retconning everything but that first movie, Halloween 2018 is a direct sequel once again following Laurie Strode, the sole surviving final girl of the original Halloween movie. Only now she's become this older, paranoid shut-in, trapped in her past trauma and drinking heavily while training and preparing relentlessly for the day that she believes inevitable, when her would-be killer Michael Myers breaks out of his incarceration and comes back to finish the job. This puts her at odds with her family, alienating her from her daughter Karen, who the state took away from her at age 12, and Laurie's only remaining social communication is with her granddaughter Allison. While each of the Strode women try to live their own lives, horror eventually strikes, exactly as Laurie predicted would happen when Michael breaks out and returns to continue his massacre from 40 years ago. Again, fairly simple plot really, it's just another Michael massacre. The only difference this time is it's set against the backdrop of a broken family dynamic and 40 years later. But there's much more meat on the bones than that surface level description. Laura quite clearly has PTSD, and it has ruled her life for 40 fucking years. She's fortifying her house, she's borderline alcoholic, she's presumably spending a shit ton of money on ammo, like, Jesus love, judging by the holes on these dummies, that's like my year's earnings. And all of this in preparation for an event that everybody in her life is telling her is never going to happen, and she really needs to get over things. This setup is a great way to show how trauma not only affects the people who suffer from it, but also has a rippling effect on everyone around them. It can change the way relationships pan out. It can change your personality and attitudes and worldview in ways that other people can find abrasive and potentially hard to deal with, and it really sucks. It's fucking dreadful when a horrible thing happens to a person that's potentially going to affect them in some small or not so small way for possibly the rest of their life. And with Laurie here, the way that the world and even her own family belittle her suffering is an unfortunate reality a lot of people who suffer through trauma have to experience. And so it is so gratifying and empowering not only when Laurie is vindicated in her supposed paranoia, but when she also uses and manipulates that past trauma, one that has in the past divided her family, into a tool that has the potential to save them. It is only through the harsh experiences of her past and how she chose to cope with that she even has a fighting chance of protecting herself and her loved ones when Michael comes back to town. It's such a strong evolution of what was once an extremely simplistic character, and such a great look at victimhood and trauma in general. I find it pretty hard hitting how in the movie all anyone wants to talk about when it comes to Laurie is her suffering. They don't see the person, they see the survivor. And she has no personhood in the eyes of anyone besides her granddaughter. She's just the crazy mom, or the news story, or the hysterical old woman. And it's no wonder she's so hell-bent on killing Michael for good, because even though he's been absent from her life all this time, he still has such a control over her. He controls her actions now, he controls how people perceive her. It's really quite a grounded depiction of the burden of trauma. And that alone, before you even consider the fact that it's also just a really good, tense, and genuinely pretty scary horror film, is to me worth the price of admission. I can't believe that Danny McBride wrote on this thing. I know he's not the only writer on the team, but his public persona is so oppositional to the level of nuance being presented here that I just can't wrap my head around him being involved at all. Also, John Carpenter returns on this thing. Not as director, mind you. That was David Gordon Green, who made what? Pineapple Express and Your Highness? How the hell are these people making Halloween? No, John Carpenter returns here as composer. Although he is obviously more famous as a director, his musical works are often equally as brilliant and iconic, and his version here of the Halloween theme, where he remixes it ever so slightly, is just it's to die for. I hate how talented this man is. Imagine making both Halloween and The Thing. Like, piss off, man. Anyway, this film has one of my favourite moments in any horror movie, ever. And I want to talk about it, but since this is a somewhat new release, I will say it is minor spoilers. So if you don't want to hear it, jump ahead to this point in the video. Otherwise, please allow me to fanboy. So what I really love about this movie is not just how it evolves on the Laurie Strode character and tells this really excellent narrative about trauma and familial maternal relationships, but also how it does this specifically by being a Halloween movie. Like, this isn't a story you can just tell as its own thing. You can certainly try to do the same plot about a wrote-off trauma victim finding the strength to finally take on her tormentor on equal footing, but it wouldn't be quite as effective were it not a Halloween movie. And to illustrate that point, I want to talk about how they repurpose iconography from the original to completely subvert its meaning. In the first film, there's a scene in the climax where Michael attacks Laurie and takes a tumble out of the window into the garden below. A seemingly fatal fall. However, when Laurie looks back down at the space where the body fell, Michael is gone. Big scary moment for Laurie. Where the fuck is he? Am I still in danger? Oh my god, he's still alive. Fast forward 40 years later, and now Laurie is the one to fall from a window in a scene that repeats this iconography. And honestly, it's the simplest thing, but when Michael looks back to see where she fell, she's gone. When I saw this moment play out in the cinema, I genuinely had tears in my eyes. My god, I'm so fucking lame. I legitimately remember doing this like breath thing where I kind of like, as it happened, was like, oh, that's my girl. Right there is this moment that 40 years ago marked a particularly horrifying memory in a sea of horrifying memories for this character, and here she is 40 years later repurposing that exact memory, weaponizing it for herself, using it for her, using it for her family. You can be pedantic about this and be all like, oh, how did she survive that fall? You know, it makes sense that Michael would because he's like an indestructible dude, but she's just a woman, she should be dead. To do so would be to fundamentally miss the point. This is a moment that exists in the realm of metaphor, not in reality. And metaphorically speaking, her trauma is now her strength. And this is articulated right in this moment in the cleanest possible illustration of that point. Fuck yes! Fuck yes! God, I love Halloween, man. Told you this was a wholesome movie. I mean, besides all the bloody teeth and gratuitous murders and stuff, but that's kind of what I'm getting at, you know? That's kind of what I'm saying. That even the horroriest of horror films, the literal Halloween franchise, the granddaddy of slasher cliches, still has so much more to say than just murders and frights. Fucking love this film. It's my favourite Halloween sequel by far, and I honestly find it such a comforting watch. Like, yes, it is another massive murder madman movie, but it's also a film that says the worst parts of your life don't have to define you, and that you can even find strength in your darkest moments, and that is bloody lovely. So, Halloween 2018 was like really fantastic. And when I started this project, I kind of just assumed that Halloween Kills would be too. Really hedged my bets there on being able to close out the season on a great movie. I got out the fancy skeleton jacket and everything. Okay, so listen. I enjoyed Halloween Kills. I paid for my ticket, I saw the movie, I had a good time, and I don't regret going. But I do understand the negative reviews. Halloween Kills is well put together. It's got some great performances, it's got some great set pieces, but as an overall package, it's quite mixed. The follow-up to the aforementioned exceptional 2018 Halloween film, which in itself was a sequel to the 1978 original retconning all other films, Halloween Kills follows that film's seemingly definitive ending, where Michael was defeated through the power of the Strode women coming together to overcome generational trauma, leaving Myers in Laurie's burning house after a final stare down which saw the power dynamics of the two shift, with Laurie using Michael's own tricks against him, like disappearing after falling from the balcony, emerging from the shadows to attack him just as he had once done, and her daughter stabbing him with his own knife, and in the final moments, Laurie towers over him as he stands staring and trapped in her burning safe room before the women leave and Laurie says her final goodbye to her would-be killer. Perfect. The phenomenal ending this series has always deserved. One that did away with all the Tatton nonsense, all the crappy familial revelations, all the weird occult stuff, and all the bad characterizations and reality show diversions to deliver a tight, meaningful story about PTSD and family that breathed new life into beloved screen icons and wrapped it all up in a slick slasher package. Except, of course, that wasn't the ending. As definitive as that finale might have seemed, Halloween is an IP that is ripe for profit, and before the release of that movie, a trilogy had already been somewhat planned, and after the much warranted success of the film both critically and commercially, development of the sequel began before the month was even over. And so Halloween Kills begins with the flames that engulfed our defeated killer being put out, and Michael emerging from the home in an admittedly killer shot, pun absolutely intended, to carry on with his kill spree once more. Now, just before I get into this film a bit more, I want to say, I hope you don't mind seeing my handsome skeleton face a bit more during this one, as with it being a brand new release, the only thing I really have to cut to is trailers. And I don't want to just repeat them too often, but the last thing I want is for the final episode of this massive 31-day project to fall at the hurdle of being pulled for copyright reasons, so I gotta play it safe on this one. I hope you'll forgive me. Also, don't worry about me spoiling stuff on this one. I realise that this is a totally new film, and a lot of people might be coming to this video still not having seen it but wanting to, so I'm just going to give a general setup and cover a general plot synopsis without giving away any major developments or the ending. Anyway, yeah, Halloween Kills follows the immediate events of Halloween 2018 1918. Laurie is bleeding from wounds and needs medical attention but is hanging on. Her daughter and granddaughter hitch a ride with her to the hospital while Laurie's house burns down with Mr. Myers in it. However, while en route to the hospital, the three witness fire engines heading to Laurie's home, and as Laurie screams "let it burn," the fire brigade arrive at the home, and upon going inside to look for survivors, they accidentally free Michael from the confinement of Laurie's safe room. He emerges from the home with one of my favourite mask designs in the series, by the way, with some of the rubber on the side of his face burned and melted from the flames. Looks super cool. And then he kills a lot of people immediately, namely the fire brigade there to save him, and the film carries on from there. However, you may be surprised to know that is not how the film opens. Instead, we open with the young Cameron, the cheating boyfriend from the first movie who went to a Halloween party in a couple's costume with Laurie's granddaughter Allison. Cameron is heading home from the party alone and still in costume when he comes across one of Michael's wounded victims, Deputy Frank Hawkins, and tries to help him. And then we flash back to a younger Hawkins at a very specific period of time and place. Haddonfield, 1978. Now, to quickly interject with some thoughts here, I was really excited to see that little date come up on the screen, and the fully realised late 70s Haddonfield looked exactly like it did when it was first filmed 40 years ago. It's really incredible that they were able to pull this off. Everything from the lighting to the costumes to the backdrops, it all emulated the 1978 film's aesthetics so much it was almost uncanny. It was like somehow someone had shot that movie's locations in that period of time, but with all the sheen that comes with the modernised cameras and hundreds of millions of dollars in budget that you get from today's big horror films. It was super cool to see such a familiar setting from this new perspective, and I was extremely excited to see why we were here and what they were going to do with it. However, while the production values are very cool, this unfortunately highlighted one of Halloween Kills' biggest problems. There's simply too much going on in it. As fun as this flashback sequence is, we simply spend too much time here, and the revelations and new information we come to from its inclusion do not justify its existence. We visit this time period more than once, and the events that transpired during this time offer us insight into the motivations and actions of several characters, but never in a way that's satisfying or feels necessary, and often in a way that seems to halt the story we're already experiencing. The novelty pretty quickly wears off, and between this, the main plot, and several subplot threads, the film feels a little scattered. I will say though, that there was one thing in these flashback sequences that made my jaw absolutely hit the floor. Very, very minor spoilers here, I suppose, as it doesn't have any real impact on the plot, but I think probably was intended as a surprise. So if you're bothered about that, skip to this time code to jump back to me carrying on with the general plot summary. But I have to say, the character Dr. Loomis, played by the late great Donald Pleasance, reappears in this sequence, and I never ever talk in movies, but when he came up on screen, I couldn't help myself but to turn to my partner and whisper, "How the fuck have they done that?" He looks amazing. I couldn't believe it. For a moment I thought they must have used some CG wizardry to reincorporate lost footage of Pleasance himself, but having now looked up how they pulled this off, it's just a look-alike in makeup and a sound-alike dubbing in the voice. Holy shit does the illusion work though. Absolutely incredible stuff. Hats off to the team on that one. I also personally feel like this is a great deal less ghoulish than this trend of having actors' likenesses portrayed entirely in CG. You know, there's an actual actor there, it's more like a recasting of a character rather than this weird practice of digitizing the image of dead people over CG puppets to do your bidding with. That's maybe just me though, and that's a whole different discussion maybe for another video. To get back to Halloween Kills, when we come back to modern times, the main plot follows Michael once again on a killing spree, and the Strode women are once again out to stop him, or at least two of them are, because Laurie, the best Strode, who has the most history with the villain and the most compelling relationship to him, is, in one of the film's more baffling decisions, relegated to sitting around in a hospital bed for most of the film's runtime, generally only being cut to so that she can deliver exposition heavy dialogue to a fellow patient that waxes poetically about the film's themes and Michael's motivations, and I'm not opposed to having Laurie be sidelined if it felt like there was strong thematic reasoning for it, like if this film was sort of a passing of the final girl torch to the younger Allison perhaps, and Laurie took on more of a remote mentoring role, but it's just disappointing. They do almost nothing with her the whole movie. I mean, good for Jamie Lee Curtis for sure. This must have been a real chill time for her, and don't get me wrong, she's not phoning it in or anything. All of her dialogue is delivered with a real emotional weight and gravitas, even if some of it is a little on the nose, but it's hardly a satisfying use of the character. In Laurie's absence though, gunning for Michael is this time an angry vigilante mob. A major part of the plotline in this one is that news gets out of Michael Myers' current escape and rampage, and this reaches a lot of the child survivors from that 1978 attack, including a very much in need of therapy and probably a PTSD diagnosis, Tommy Doyle, the young kid that Laurie once babysat who was present during Michael's first attack on her, here played by Anthony Michael Hall. Sorry Paul Rudd fans. On hearing the news, Tommy immediately begins to incite a mob of people to hunt the man down, taking leadership over this newly riled up bunch. This, I think, has been a pretty divisive aspect of the movie, but I actually really like it. Don't get me wrong, it has its flaws. There's a little too much suspension of disbelief asked of some of their actions, their chosen chant is a little annoying and corny, and their thematic ideas are delivered in a very on-the-nose manner. I shit you not, there's a scene where a character pretty much turns to the camera and is like, perhaps we are the real monsters, or something very similar, and it is as eye-rolling and groan-worthy as it sounds. This film did not place much confidence in its audience's intelligence. Like, yeah, I think we got that, mate. But on the other hand, it gives it a new and refreshing dynamic to the proceedings that sets it apart from other slasher and Halloween films. You'll recall in my Halloween 4 video that I lamented the lack of any meaning or interesting conflict present from the introduction of the vigilante mob. At the time I wrote that video, this film wasn't even out yet, but it's kind of surreal how much of it feels like a direct response to those criticisms. The mob this time round don't just kind of have one compelling moment that's never explored again like they did in Halloween 4, they're almost the whole film's central conceit this time. The introduction of their dynamic gives the film a ton of new problems and conflicts to work with, and although yes, the ideas surrounding their introduction are explored with all the subtlety of a hammer in the face, they are at least something thematic to take away from this film that is discussed and explored as opposed to just appearing and then kind of ignored as the mob once was in Halloween 4. That film didn't seem to have any stance on them, whereas this film makes the purpose of their inclusion far clearer. Anyway, without getting too much into spoilers, that's the general gist of the film. There's a few different plot threads going, the revelations of the flashbacks to 1978, the angry mob, Laurie in the hospital bed, her daughter and granddaughter's relationship with others, the older of the two, Karen, has a lot of conflict with Tommy for example, and the younger, Allison, is reunited in her hunt for Michael with cheating boyfriend Tommy, and of course, there's the general thread of the Strodes in particular wanting Michael dead, and Michael going around and killing people with a much greater focus on the brutality and violence of it, which on its own also introduces a bunch of new characters, sometimes part of the angry mob, sometimes separate from the mob, but they're all briefly explored before they have their own encounters with the stabby fella. Most of those people are uninteresting and forgettable, but shout out to Big John and Little John, the couple now living at the old Myers household, as being a highlight. Those guys are cool, really likeable, charismatic, and share a great deal of chemistry. Really enjoyed the dynamic of whenever those two were on screen. And you know, generally speaking, that's Halloween Kills. I probably sound pretty negative on it for the most part, but there is actually a lot of stuff I like here. Michael Myers feels like a really relentless force in this one. With a lot more characters scattered around, there's a lot more time for him to flex his ferocity. And he's basically like the Terminator meets Jason Voorhees in this one. As brutal as the latter and as unstoppable as the former. It's probably the most fierce we've ever seen the character. And while some of that comes at the expense of tension, there's still something to be said for just how much of a truly intense force of nature he feels this time around. As already mentioned, I don't hate the angry mob stuff as much as a lot of other people. It could have been better executed, sure, but it's got something to say, and it's a bit of a change of pace from the general skulking and stalking that permeates not just Halloween, but to an extent, every other slasher movie. It gives the film a unique identity. Like, you can always refer to this one as the one about the mob, rather than just, You know, the other one that's also about Michael. It also can get genuinely emotional at times. There's a sequence in this film where I really felt a lot of empathy for what was happening on screen. It was legitimately sad, and more so than any other slasher films, there's a bit more of a focus on the victims of violence and the people left behind. It's not a huge focus per se, but for example, Allison's father, who died at the end of the previous movie, is mentioned and mourned on multiple occasions throughout this film, and that felt strangely refreshing. So many slashers, including some of my favourites, often forget about characters the second they die. I mean, look at the first Scream, which I love. A major character's sister dies in that movie, and you could honestly forget they were even related because she's just never mentioned again. On the subject of victims as well, this feels like the first film in the series that actively acknowledges that those with mental illnesses are more likely to be victims of violence and not the perpetrators. As much as I adore Halloween 1978 and 2018, they really rely on the overplayed trope of escaped mental patient. But this film seems to make a concerted effort to distance Michael from the idea of mental illness by, for the first time, offering a sympathetic mentally ill character in vast contrast with his violence. It almost feels like the film is kind of saying like, yeah, Michael spent time in institutions for the mentally ill, but that's more or less because no one knew where to put him. His problem isn't that he's mentally ill, it's that he's just evil. And when another character who spent time in the same institution as Michael gets a fair amount of screen time, the film does well to contrast the two, and I actually think it has a lot to say about how we as a society perceive the mentally ill, as there are a lot of people in this film who wrongly assume this new mentally ill character to be equally dangerous and capable of the same horrendous acts as Michael is. So look, it really does have a lot going for it, and it is a fun night out. It's just, here's the thing with Halloween Kills. It's busy. While the previous film felt extremely streamlined, tight and focused, Kills has a lot of big ideas but not really enough time to explore all of them, and ends up a loose connection of a bunch of narrative threads that have some good moments and set pieces in them, but ultimately the sum of their parts wind up not really leading to much and feeling scattered. So much of what are listed as positives aren't persistent. They're just moments of positivity in otherwise unfocused clutter. And here's the other thing with Halloween Kills. It's not scary. And granted, obviously, I'm someone who watches a fair amount of horror. The 31 back-to-back videos on the subject this and last year might have gave you that impression. So I'm maybe a little harder to scare than most. I don't actually think that's the case, but you know, I'm willing to concede that's a possible factor that's colouring my perception here. But having said that, even when I'm personally not scared of a film, I can recognise when it is scary, if that makes sense. I have watched the original 1978 Halloween so many times now that it has absolutely zero effect on me. But I still can recognise when it crafts tension. I can sense when something is suspenseful and scratching at those senses that make your hair stand on end. Halloween Kills simply does not do this. It makes no attempt to be suspenseful. Violent and dealing with unpleasant subject matter, sure, but never in a way that seems to make any significant effort to scare you. And that's not even just me saying that. The director has pretty much kind of admitted that was the intention. When promoting the film's release, David Gordon Green went on the Evolution of Horror podcast to talk about the film. In his interview, he said that Halloween Kills isn't so much about tension building this time, it's more about aggression. And he went on to say how in horror, it's really about surprise or suspense, and that they chose to go more with surprise in this one. And like, that's cool, that's fine or whatever, but is that Halloween? Granted, you don't need to stay handcuffed to the ideas and mood of the original film, and it does give us the far more violent and brutal Michael, which in its own way is kind of a highlight as I've already mentioned, but it does strike me as an odd decision when you consciously chose to tie yourself to that film specifically, willingly creating a narrative that ignored all other entries in the series, put that one on a pedestal, and went, this is the one that counts. The last film found a nice balance between suspense and surprise. It had a lot of brutal gore that punctuated its runtime, but it also had a great deal of drawn out tension. To actively go for surprise and aggression in your film feels at odds with the premise you're building upon. They certainly achieve what they set out to do, there's no denying that here, but it makes for a Michael Myers that feels more like Jason Voorhees with his focus on jumping out for cool and furious graphic kills and a high body count, and it creates a film that lacks any real degree of tension or suspense. Now granted, this is probably coming off really negative, but legitimately, I'm not actually super down on this one as a lot of people are. It's a bit disappointing when narratively following what I consider to be two exceptional movies, but it's still by far one of the better Halloween sequels in the grand scheme of things, and probably still the third, maybe fourth best Halloween movie overall in my opinion. I'd say go see it. You might roll your eyes at a couple of points, and you're very unlikely to be scared by it, and it's definitely not going to blow your socks off or anything, but it's a fun movie and still a good way to spend a Friday night at the cinemas. You'll definitely like it if you're a fan of the Friday the 13th movies, and you'll probably like it if you're a fan of Halloween. A recommendation for sure, just not a completely glowing one. Now, the last time I looked at the Halloween franchise was at the end of slasher season with the kind of middle of the road Halloween Kills. Since then though, Halloween Ends released, a film I did not cover for the channel because oh my god did it disappoint me and I did not want to. However, now I found myself in a predicament, because like an absolute masochistic tool, I have agreed, when no one forced me to cover all of the reboots I missed during Wholesome Halloween 2, and Halloween has not had one, but two films in that reboot saga, as Rob Zombie got his own sequel to his take on the character. And with not having covered Halloween Ends prior to this video, I also can't really hit the spirit of completionism this little mini marathon was made in service of without talking about all three films, can I? Well, shit. Okay, so look, I'm up against the wall with deadlines right now to stay on track with the main Wholesome Halloween, so here's the deal. I will cover all three of the missing Halloween movies, but it's going to be quick. It's going to be snappy. Quick flash coverage of each of them. Think of it, instead of getting like a big bar of dairy milk, you're getting a multi-pack of Freddos. And those things require you to take a second mortgage out on your house to buy them these days, so that shit has value. Okay, so let's start with the Rob Zombie movies. So the Halloween series was in a bit of a mess after a slew of less than stellar sequels we've already talked about, and a variety of ideas were being kicked around to try and breathe new life into the franchise, including at one point a crossover with the Hellraiser series that sounded a bit mental and would have retroactively added in a plot that Michael Myers was actually a presumably pretty normal young boy, but got possessed by the demon Samhain, who escaped hell by taking over his body after young Michael travelled to hell because he solved the lament configuration. Sounds absolutely batshit, but still makes more sense than whatever the hell happened in Halloween 6. Obviously though, that didn't happen, and although the plan was to make a direct sequel at some point rather than a reboot, that plan quickly came to a halt after series producer Mustafa Akkad tragically died in the 2005 Amman bombings. Mustafa's son Malik eventually decided to go in a different direction, and although many pitches were bandied around, what was eventually settled on was just a start from scratch, straight remake, with Rob Zombie given the task to helm. Zombie, a huge fan of the original film, actually approached John Carpenter before the announcement out of respect to let him know he'd be doing this, and Carpenter's only request was that Zombie make it his own. And well, he did just that. Rob Zombie's Halloween gets a lot of shtick, as all Rob Zombie films tend to. The dude is an acquired taste, but I actually think it's a really interesting film, and hot take, probably one of the strongest films in the franchise. Don't get me wrong, it's not a scratch on the original or 2018, but some people might get a little mad at me for saying this. I think it's maybe at like Halloween 4 level. I think one of the reasons it's so divisive though for fans of the franchise is while it might be one of the better films in the series on just a basic technical and plotting level, it's arguably one of the worst Halloween films, depending on your definition of what defines a Halloween movie. You see, Rob Zombie's film commits what some would consider an absolute cardinal sin for a Halloween movie to do. It humanizes Michael Myers. The way Zombie took on Carpenter's advice of making the film his own was to make it not just a remake, but also a prequel. Whereas the original film spent one shocking opening scene with Kid Michael and then nothing more, a huge portion of Zombie's film, which he also wrote the screenplay for, is dedicated to what makes Michael tick. We spend a significant chunk of the movie with Michael as a child, seeing his crappy abusive home life, his habit of killing animals, how he is a victim of a bully, and his eventual brutal murder of said bully. We see him be sentenced and his time in the sanitarium with child psychologist Dr. Loomis, here portrayed by Malcolm McDowell taking over for Donald Pleasance, and he's actually fantastic in the role, probably one of the best parts of the movie. And we see Michael begin to disassociate and grow fixated on masks during his time there and morph into something more akin to the Michael Myers we know. It's actually pretty interesting stuff. It's just very at odds with the central premise of what Halloween was originally set up to be, since so much of the fear factor of that story revolved around Michael having no clear motivation or reasoning for doing what he did. He was just a cold, dead, evil soul that inexplicably pursued violence. Zombie takes it in the completely opposite direction, which isn't going to gel well with everybody since it's kind of the antithesis of what was such a huge appeal of the Michael Myers character to begin with, but if you take it as its own thing, it's genuinely the best material in the movie, even if it does feel like Michael Myers fanfiction. And that's the thing with Zombie's Halloween output. I can't remember who said it, but one time a guest on the Evolution of Horror podcast hit the nail on the head by suggesting that John Carpenter's Halloween cares about Laurie, whereas Zombie's Halloween cares about Michael. Which is why when the film does eventually become a remake of Halloween, it kind of begins to fall apart. There's some strengths to this aspect of it. Michael Myers is genuinely intimidating as hell in Zombie's take on the character, far more aggressively violent and brutal than previous iterations. And portrayed by ex-pro wrestler Tyler Mane, the dude has a giant physique that makes him a really imposing figure. And Malcolm McDowell continues to be great throughout as Loomis. The problem is that this section of the film is where it just starts to feel a bit like an original Halloween tribute act, with a large number of shots and sequences being pulled straight from Carpenter's 1978 effort, albeit occasionally littered with more of that trademark Rob Zombie scuzz that scales up a bit of the violence and the amount of screen time spent on boobs. It sort of feels a bit pointless. Inoffensive, it's not awful or anything, but I just don't know what this adds to the 1978 film. Speaking of the Rob Zombie scuzz, your mileage may vary on how much you're able to enjoy the movie when it includes that, because boy, there are some scenes in this film that are scuzzy. Sometimes the edgy intensity works. I remember seeing this film for the first time at a friend's house when I was way too young to watch it, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a child be murdered on screen. And seeing that happen at the hands of another kid in a really drawn out and intense way made the film feel really shocking and dangerous, like something I shouldn't be watching. But on the other hand, even as a child, kind of rolled my eyes at how sleazy Michael Myers' family were. I get Zombies communicating just how stressful Michael's childhood and his familial relationships were, but it's so excessively done. The boyfriend character is particularly cartoonish, throwing out every possible misogynistic, homophobic, bigoted comment he could manage in his short screen time, and just in case that wasn't seedy enough, they make sure to have him make gross comments on his girlfriend's underage daughter. I actually have a lot of respect for Zombie, both as an artist and he actually seems like a pretty cool person, but his films can really stray into the realms of mean-spiritedness sometimes in pursuit of that edgy, transgressive vibe, often to the detriment of the film's quality. The director's cut even has a really unnecessary sexual assault on a female inmate at Michael's sanitarium at one point that's just... oof. It just does not remotely need to be there. Definitely go with the theatrical version if you're going to watch this one, if not for any other reason than to just avoid that. Get past all of that though and the fairly redundant remake sections, and it's not a particularly bad film at all. Zombie, for all of his flaws, is a decent director, and the original stuff he puts in the first half of the movie makes you wish he'd just do more stuff in the franchise that's just his own, since that's actually the stuff he seems to be best at. And then you see Halloween 2 and you're like, huh, okay, maybe not. Maybe don't do that. Zombies Halloween sequel is something. I'm not sure it's a good something. I'm not even sure it's a bad something, but it's certainly something. It's a very unique film full of confusing decisions that certainly takes the Halloween concept and Michael Myers' character in its own direction. I'm just not sure what the hell that direction was meant to be. Once again, written and directed by Zombie, the 2009 sequel is him removed from the constraints of having to remake the original in any way and just doing his own thing entirely. And it turns out his own thing is horses. Just make the whole movie have a really strange fixation on white horses. I'm oversimplifying things, of course, but if you haven't seen this film and you just went, huh? It's kind of how I felt too. Taking place 1 year after the events of the first film, or 2 years for some reason if you're watching the director's cut. I don't know why that title card change was made. Laurie is now suffering from PTSD after having shot Michael at the end of the first movie. I will say immediately, in recognition of this film's strengths, that Laurie here, portrayed by Scout Taylor Compton, who did a fine job in Zombie's original effort but I otherwise didn't think too much of, is actually astounding in this film. And that applies in both versions. Interestingly, between the director's cut and the theatrical cut, the different editing of each film gives her two completely different personalities. In the theatrical, she's a bit sweeter, although still emotionally rattled from that first movie, whereas in the director's cut, that emotional trauma manifests itself in a lot more lashing out. Whichever version you watch though, you'll get a Laurie who is giving it her all, struggling to hang on to what sanity she has left and selling her past trauma with a significant emotional weight and gravity. Seems like Zombie worked out how to care about Laurie and not just Michael with this second movie. While Laurie has been dealing with her recovery, Loomis on the other hand has been cashing in on his past, writing a book about his experience coming toe to toe with the big fella. And is it just me, or is Loomis kind of terrible in this one? I don't know why, because he was literally like the best part of the first movie. But again, Zombie just has to find ways to shove in a bit of mean-spiritedness throughout his films. And for some reason, one of the ways he chose to do it this time is by making Loomis an insufferable arsehole. I wouldn't mind that at all, and I get why the character would change and evolve, and not necessarily in positive ways. Plus I know he does get a redemption arc later in the movie, but Zombie just goes way too hard, way too quick in making the guy awful. At one point in the director's cut, he casually threatens to beat his female assistant, and it's like, dude, where the hell did that come from? Anyway, between the two of them, they both seem to be attempting to move on with their lives. Laurie through her recovery, and Loomis with his turning it into a quick buck. But naturally, things aren't going to stay smooth for long, as after the showdown of the first movie, it is revealed that an obviously not at all dead Michael Myers managed to escape and go missing when the ambulance carrying what was thought to be his corpse has a brutal crash into a cow. Yeah, this film makes some very odd choices, and that is by no means the weirdest one of them. Obviously what follows is the standard game of cat and mouse slasher antics, as Michael returns to Haddonfield to pursue his sister. And oh yeah, just for your information, in this timeline they did keep the Laurie is secretly Michael's sister angle going. And all of this slasher stuff is carried out under the eye of a completely unrestrained Zombie, who really goes to town with the gore on this one. It is easily the most graphically violent Halloween film out there. A divisive element for sure, although to be fair, this was actually a touch I didn't mind. It's a different way to make Michael terrifying than the cold, distant quality of Carpenter's original vision, but there's no denying that the dude is monstrous in this outing, and it gives him a hell of a presence. What I'm not so keen on is the scattering of just total bizarreness throughout this film. I very much appreciate the attempt to do something totally different, but man, the dude really forces the white horse motif. It all starts with Michael getting a gift of a white horse figure as a kid, and then as he grows up, he keeps seeing visions of his ghost mom with a white horse. And then Laurie sees a white horse in a Rorschach painting, and the opening credits in the director's cut tries to explain the inclusion of the white horse with a quote about the psychology behind it. But I don't think it makes any more sense even with this. Like, cool, it represents his anger. I mean, okay, but why though? and things only get weirder with a really extended dream sequence, and then somehow Laurie can see Michael's ghost mom even though no one else can, and she starts sharing his hallucinations and stuff. It's all just really baffling. She even for some reason tells Michael she loves him at the end as like a goodbye to her brother, and I get that he's biological family, but also absolutely not. That internal conflict of balancing the idea of family with his terror is nowhere near enough narrative focus to warrant that. And then depending on which version you watch, theatrical or director's cut, Laurie either ends up dead and seeing Ghost Deborah and her white horse, or in an asylum and seeing Ghost Deborah and her white horse. What? It's just really baffling and confusing in places, though I will say, shot on 16mm, it's a pretty gorgeously grungy film with a really nice film grain that complements Zombie's visual style perfectly. That doesn't stop it though from being a very strange film and an odd entry into the Halloween franchise, but I'd say it's still worth checking out as a curiosity piece and for Laurie and the excessively gory slasher antics. Although I will add, if you're a Halloween purist, I think you might get real upset with some of the costume and mask choices in this one. I actually quite like this look, but man, this is giving Frankenstein, not Michael Myers. Now I suppose I should talk about Halloween Ends, and oh boy, I do not like Halloween Ends. I know that's not a hot take or anything, but it's just kinda terrible. To its credit, I think conceptually there's some good ideas here on paper. It's just the execution of these ideas that really doesn't work. The film doesn't really follow Michael this time round until the third act, which I know is going to instantly upset some people. Instead, our big killer this time out is a newcomer to the series called Corey Cunningham. You see, we open with Corey babysitting a kid on Halloween, but after an accident while under Corey's care sends the kid plummeting to his death, a genuine shock by the way, I'll give the film that, the town ostracizes him, with many convinced he killed the kid intentionally, which naturally puts Corey at odds with everyone there, and he begins to become reserved and shrink into himself. Things do seem to perk up for the lad though when he starts a romantic relationship with Ultimate Final Girl Laurie Strode's granddaughter, Allison. But this is where we start to really see the cracks of this film form. After going to a Halloween party with Allison and having a good night for the first time since the babysitting incident, Corey is cut down to size when the kid's mother catches him in his moment of joy and isn't too happy to see that. Allison does try to comfort him, and hold up, before we go any further, I'm sorry, what is up with this mid-CW TV drama level dialogue?
I was just trying to help you to just...
I'm not your fucking project, Allison!
Corey, I know! Okay, I know what it's like to have everybody looking at you thinking that they know you, thinking that they know what you've been through, but they don't.
These two are unbearable as a pair. The melodrama of their lines are absolutely horrendous. Every scene they're in just sucks the life out of you. It makes you feel like you're watching some teen drama about a couple of goths whose parents totally don't get them.
And you think you can fix me, but you can't. I'll spare you the heartache.
And this guy is supposed to replace Michael Myers, one of the most iconic villains in cinema, as our big bad guy for most of this film's outing? What a downgrade. And I'm not just saying this because I'm some Michael Myers purist. I actually really like the idea and concept of a town so torn up by the trauma of Michael's brutality that they've become this unforgiving, suspicious and paranoid community incapable of forgiveness and immediately mistrusting of anyone with an even slightly difficult past, to the point that they essentially force the Michael Myers role onto someone else. I think that's a really interesting concept. It's just that, well, Corey isn't very interesting at all. No disrespect to the actor, it's not his fault, it's just what he's got to work with. But this dude is two-dimensional as hell. He's completely one note when he's shy and reserved after his ostracization, and then does a complete 180 and emanates just cartoonish levels of I'm the outcast, I'm a weirdo with a dark past. I don't even know how to explain it. I think it's meant to be bad boy vibes to justify Allison's instant attraction, but it reads more like school shooter. Because, oh yeah, in case you forgot, this guy's our killer. How does that come about, you ask? Well, some bullies in the town throw him off a bridge to be mean, and he's dragged into a sewer that Michael Myers has just been chilling in after Halloween Kills for several years. But Michael, instead of killing Corey, I don't know, sees the darkness inside his soul or something and chooses to spare him. And then Corey very quickly develops a taste for murder after that, first killing a homeless man and then inviting Allison's douchey ex-boyfriend into the sewer with Michael, and the two become like little buddy murderers. If you remember back in, I want to say my Halloween 5 or 6 video, I actually pitched a story I thought was cool within which Michael Myers took on an apprentice. So I'm definitely not opposed to this plot point. I just don't know why they had to do it in a way that feels so daft. I don't even know how to articulate exactly how flat this comes off, but there's just nothing to latch onto here. Corey is dull. I don't understand or feel anything with his connection to Michael. Michael is a background character in the conclusion to his own saga. Like, what is going on? And again, there's some really interesting elements here. Michael being old and weaker now, you can do something compelling with that. Finding the human quality in an unbridled monster. But do we need a scene in which this dude just marches into Michael's home and bashes him about because he wants his mask? The concept that the Strode women are so broken by trauma and that one of their most important relationships in life and a lot of the defining moments of their past are tied to a violent man, that sometimes, like with Allison, they can't help but find themselves gravitating towards violent men, is an interesting idea to explore. But not when they make Corey and Allison's romance such a wet fart of an occurrence. There's lots of excellent themes at play here that tie in perfectly with the themes the 2018 requel set up for this continuity. Trauma as an omnipresent force within a community, trauma with regards to women's relationships to male violence, how the people who create others' trauma can be aggrandized in their victim's head as an unstoppable monster, but how they're just humans who age and grow weak and frail like everyone else at their core. There's lots of really great elements to play with here. It's just that none of them are explored in any meaningful way. Just kind of gestured at in a trivial manner before they move on to the next disconnected idea scattered amongst this somehow both bizarre and yet meandering and uneventful feeling plot. Here's a perfect example of how crap they execute some of the film's better ideas. So there's kind of this theme of Michael as this corrupting force. He's this darkness that kind of looms over Haddonfield in ways that even in his absence, his presence is still felt. The town is even cruel to Laurie, arguably his most significant victim, to not lose her life to him for what they see as somehow her being responsible for bringing his violence into their world. Victim blaming being another theme that sprouts up here, but that is never fully explored. But keeping on Michael as the corrupting force for now, we see Michael treated as almost like a contagious plague through Corey, in the sense that Corey doesn't just become a killer, Corey becomes a Michael Myers. But what is one of the ways the film communicates this? Well, he does Michael's iconic sit-up movement, which would totally mean something if he did it in a context that made it unsettling. Maybe in bed next to Allison through the night, or in the context of him slaying one of his victims, or honestly, the best circumstance would be in a somewhat trivial way, but as he does it, we just get a little hint of that Halloween musical cue, an allusion to something not being right. But nah. Dude just has a fall and then sits up, and that's it. No creepy context, no musical cue, just a bare bones, oh, I guess he just did the thing. By the conclusion of the movie, you've witnessed a lot of potential with a bunch of great concepts, but not a single one of them is fully realised. And then in the third act, they quickly abandon the Corey as the villain stuff anyway to have the Laurie and Michael final standoff the film had initially been marketed as, which just leaves you thinking, what was the point in any of that? The film isn't completely without merit. There's actually some fun slasher stuff in there. A graphic death with a tongue on a record player makes for a particularly great bit of morbidly gruesome black comedy, and there's an occasional cool visual. I think the sequence with Corey and Michael teaming up to kill Allison's work rival and her mean boss actually makes Corey come off kind of intimidating and intense, but the highs are hugely outweighed by the lows. And by the end of it, what should be a huge catharsis that puts to bed a multiple decades long story just kind of falls flat. I appreciate them trying something different. I really do. I actually really wanted something different. But like, if you're gonna do that, maybe stick with 1 or 2 ideas, guys. Because this is such a mishmash of everything that it ends up feeling like nothing. And that is the last 3 remaining films of Halloween I had to cover. And yeah, don't know what to tell you. Halloween might be the greatest slasher film of all time, but the franchises are a real mixed bag. At the end of the day though, the rare highs are worth the common lows, which is something you can probably say about most of the big slasher icons. And speaking of slashers, that brings us to the end of Wholesome Halloween 2.5 Slasher Season, the reboot. I hope you've enjoyed filling in these little gaps in these sagas as much as I have. It feels really great to have a proper, complete, up-to-date picture of these series. It really feels like something I'm happy to have accomplished, and as a huge added bonus, the creation of these 4 episodes will, by the end of Wholesome Halloween 3, mean that I have created exactly 100 episodes in the Wholesome Halloween saga. And that is such a crazy thought that makes me feel so proud of what's been accomplished here. I know it's just a bunch of videos on horror movies where I paint my face, but you'd be surprised at how much work goes into even one of these things. So to be approaching such a huge milestone is genuinely something I'm very proud of. So speaking of that milestone, thank you all for your incredible support, and I hope you'll all join me on the main public channel uploads as we carry on and conclude the final Wholesome Halloween marathon. God, it feels good to tie up these loose ends here first and really feel that sense of completion. I am totally hyped now going into the end goal, and I'm excited for all of you to see this thing to its conclusion. I know there's some of you who have watched every episode, and I can't tell you how much that means to me that you would all give me so much of your time, and I just really want to thank you all for that. Anyway, that's enough yammering from me. Love you all, and I'll see you later. Bye!